Yeah, yeah. Hello, everybody. Yeah, no, I'm super excited to get this rolling. I mean, yeah, QRI has been very active for the last few years, and all the while, yeah, like interesting things are happening in the world. It's a very, very interesting time, I would say. Definitely in the realm of understanding, consciousness, intelligence, the nature of reality. Um, and yeah, life more broadly. Yeah, in this the last few years, we have really kind of like made a big push to publish in academia, various philosophy papers, some neuroscience investigation. We also organized the legal psychedelic retreats with various physicists, mathematicians, visual artists, and meditators. Um, and yeah, building mathematical paradigms for phenomenology, which is what we're doing, yeah, pretty much every day these days. It's effectively figuring out how to represent accurately different states of consciousness in ways that are insightful and have practical applications. Of course, yeah, in on the side, I've continued to be my hyper philosophical self. So yeah, I have a novel, in some sense, yeah, like takes on age-old questions that I'm sure a lot of you have pondered about, ranging from personal identity to the binding problem to, yeah, for example, like the state space of qualia more broadly. So, yeah, I'm essentially, yeah, game for chatting about anything. I My slight preference is to kind of like keep it casual and also have you guys introduce yourselves a little bit and kind of like talk about your own interests and why you're here in kind of this yeah, kind of like friendly casual way, as opposed to being grilled by some kind of a yeah philosophical mob, which yeah, of course, I don't expect or anticipate that to be the case. But yeah, let's have fun. So um I'll let yeah, Bernie kind of uh yeah, guide and to some extent ground the discussion, and also please let me know if I'm yeah, just rambling too much or or yeah, being redundant in some way. So yeah, let's have fun.
Okay, so hello, I'm Edu from Barcelona, and I studied the degree in economics. So, uh, most people don't know about theoretical economics, and particularly microeconomics comes from 19th century moral philosophy, which is essentially Stuart Mill and closed individualism slash libertarianism, etc. But if we apply the closed loop open what was open individualism, closed individualism, and empty individualism to the equation.
Yes.
Exactly. The whole theory of economics kind of falls apart, and something can grow which is more in line with altruistic economics and something like this. Have you thought about this? Do you know anyone in California who has done work on this? Thank you.
Ooh, yeah, fantastic question. I mean, maybe I'll yeah, to kind of like kickstart a little bit of the yeah, in some sense the casual conversational vibe. I mean, um I was surprised that a recent tweet that I put out about economics and kind of how it intersects with consciousness research. I think it's like the most liked and retweeted tweet of all times that I have at least put out. I think it has like 4,000 and a half, 4.5 thousand, likes. Where essentially, yeah, describe a interaction that I had with a kid in college. This was over 15 years ago, or maybe maybe more. No, about like 15 years ago, um, where I was at a party and there was this very, very eloquent kid, just actually making a lot of sense, talking about philosophy of mind and economics. And yeah, yeah, I approached him. He was pretty loud, actually. Like it was pretty easy to kind of like overhear him. So like, hey, there's a very philosophical kid over there. Let me talk to him. And he was kind of like making this elaborate, argument that society is not actually made of individuals, so that it's actually made of attention streams, and that kind of like really making a careful analysis of economics um, in a very objective way would suggest that society is not made of kind of like rational individual actors that are pursuing their own utility function or anything of the sort. It's more kind of this complex dynamic system of attention streams that carry information about possible resources to identify and maybe extract and information to process, and that it's not really individuals coming together to achieve a goal. It's more attention streams kind of like clumping together within individuals and across individuals, within moments of experience and across time. And it's very complex, yeah, network of intentions and desires, and the individual is just a mask. I mean, like it's just kind of like a made up story that is part of like the software that we use to process information and society, but underneath is actually just attention streams trying to recruit each other as kind of this massive network of ants, in a way, attention ants, if you will. Um, I thought that was like, yeah, incredibly fascinating. And he was also telling me like, oh yeah, and I'm emailing my professors about this, and I'm gonna write papers. I'm gonna write a book about this, and he was just very enthusiastic. Later that night, after I was done talking to him, I learned that he got into a fight, and like it was kind of surprising, and it seemed like out of character. But I said like, okay, whatever. People are complex. Um, and then like about a week later, I encountered him in the cafeteria, and I asked him like, hey, how's it going? Like, how's your theory? Like, it was awesome talking to you the other day, and he just said, yeah, I just came out of the hospital. I was having a manic episode. When I talked to him, I actually hadn't slept in 4 days. And, and like, he was kind of in this like manic episode where he was having all of these kind of like big revelations about society and the nature of economics. And rather than sleeping, he was just like spending 6 hours a day, at night, just rather than sleeping, he was just like writing about his theory. And, I believe he actually, to give you like a sense of how these manic episodes sometimes work, is that I believe he used to be prescribed Adderall for concentration. I think he wasn't taking it every day or anything like that. It was just kind of as needed kind of like aid for his ADHD. But when he had his manic episode, actually he said something like, "Hey, I'm maturing. Clearly, my brain is like now functioning really well without like any aids, without food, without sleep." And he gifted his Adderall to random people in his dorm. And this is just to kind of like give you a sense of how powerful a manic episode actually is. That is like oftentimes is actually described as like much more euphoric and intellectually stimulating than even methamphetamine or something like that, or cocaine or whatever. Um, and yeah, it was kind of unfortunate that like after he was like stabilized with meds, um, all of his opinions on economics became kind of like again very mainstream and standard and boring and not that interesting. And the same with philosophy of mind. He became a Dennetian reductionist, deflationary perspectives on consciousness. Um, yeah, so I thought like that was like very inspirational though. Like I don't think he was thinking about it exactly from the perspective of kind of a generalized conception of personal identity. But it was clear that he was kind of like at least softening the boundaries between individuals, right? Like, and thinking of the unit as more kind of like how we pay attention to things as opposed to, yeah, like our individual stories. Um, I think that something like this is extremely promising and definitely overlooked, because if from an economic perspective, if the resources that you kind of like care about are things such as you know yeah, actual physical resources, or like the energy that people have, or like positional goods, and things of the sort, and you think like that is what is motivating people, um, you may actually be failing to see, in some sense, actually, like the zero sum nature of this like massive bottleneck in the economy, which is actually, yeah, like attention and our consciousness. Um, but more so, like how do you express your values and what kind of society you want to will absolutely depend on your conception of your identity. Um, and by default, I think that is not even the case that we are closed individualists in our behavior, right? Like if you kind of like look at how we behave very objectively and try to, in some sense, like determine if we're selfish or not, I would argue that like this individualist perspective is not even empirically the case. Rather, like we're actually kind of these like complex networks of interests oftentimes at odds, where we're trying to, improve the reputation of our family, of our community. Um, we're trying to kind of like associate our identity with our friends, and also with our culture. But then, on top of that, oftentimes we get colonized by memes, right? Like, just as like a selfish gene, in a sense, is trying to replicate across individuals, and the individual is kind of like a convenient fiction. People are, empirically, they're willing to sacrifice themselves, in order to save, three siblings or eight cousins, or things like that. As long as the genetic material ends up, averaging out to more than what you yourself would be able to contribute to the gene pool, then oftentimes we're willing to do that sacrifice empirically. The same with memes. I mean, like, people clearly are very often, like, they sacrifice their own genetic interests, their own economic interests in the service of a meme. And if your theory of economics is not taking that into account, there's just going to be a lot of empirical puzzles, a lot of things that just it fails to predict. But that is even just in the in the descriptive side. Is like, hey, like, an individual utility function based conception of economics with closed individualism fails to kind of describe society accurately. But it's not only that; it also kind of like carries with it an implicit prescription, right? It's in some sense a lot of economics, as far as I can tell. At the very least, the vibe of this area of research is somewhat prescriptive. Is like, hey, and by the way, this is how it should be, because, hey, with our naive models, if everybody's pursuing their own selfish interest, like, society as a whole can kind of flourish. Um, but I think, like, yeah, more, a more enriched conception of identity that, yeah, takes into account consciousness as the unit of value, and the degrees of consciousness, and the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain, and fuzzy identities, is not only maybe like better at describing how we behave. It also would actually gives us a very different prescription for what would be an ideal economics. And here's one very concrete example before, yeah, I pass it on to anybody else who might want to ask a question. And that is, um, that if you model an individual as kind of this collection of sub-agents, I think it is very often the case that, some sub-agents, that have kind of like a small time horizon, sometimes they gang up in order to kind of like take control of the organism, um, and disregard kind of the long-term goals. And if you have this view, this kind of prescriptive view of economics, where you say, like, well, that's just like revealed preference, like, clearly this is what the organism wants, you're just not realizing that there's actually some infighting inside that very organism, and that actually that person may want, it's coherent extrapolated evolution, as it were, may want to actually get rid of those, that gang of sub-agents that only cares about like a short time horizon. And so if you're just thinking of people as kind of, individual agents, um, you actually become vulnerable to kind of sub-agent takeover. And I think, like, yeah, to a large extent, that is what does happen in society a lot. We end up privileging, values like, yeah, maximizing the GDP or something like that, as opposed to realizing, hey, valence and well-being is what matters, and it's only correlated, but it's not absolutely not the same thing as GDP. Anyway, yeah, some high level big perspectives on this question. But yeah, fantastic topic.
It was nice. Okay,
Yeah, I will just say that, yeah, game theory is very individualistic, and with the paradigms that QRI is making, we can like do more discussion of gender and everything. Well, thank you.
we need.
Yeah.
we can-
Actually, yeah. Yes. Let me comment on that. Yeah. Game theory, indeed, it assumes a kind of like a closed individualism, kind of like, individual agent with utility function perspective. But even biology, standard biology really goes beyond that, right? Because one of the options that you have available in biology is not only, hey, like, you cooperate or you defect against other agents in your environment, you also have the option of merging with them, And so what is going on there, right? Like if your prisoner's dilemma, payoff matrix has also the option of like, hey, you can choose to become one with the other, and blend your utility functions, that completely, I think, changes the calculus of what is possible. And yeah, I'm happy to speculate more in this direction if people are curious. I will just point out that Michael Levin is very, very aware of this distinction, and he also talks a lot about this, how like just looking at life very objectively already transcends kind of our standard conceptions of game theory.
Yes, I I had the thought as well. Okay, I'm gonna invite to speak now Sat, Sat, Satorit. Okay.
Yeah. Hey, what's up, everyone? Satori. Actually, I kind of go by Satori D, but I like Satori as well. I think what I wanted to talk about is like even to like further on this thing we're talking about, and like my own area or beachhead into this is kind of poetics and poetry. And just recently, I kind of just because I was playing around with some LML about decoding the word dream, and like the root word of the Old English word dream meant joy, noise, or music. And so, like that for me, when I talk about like poetry and the thing that I like to make music out of my own experiences that transcend uh regular reality, I guess, is looking into this artwork that I do, and old artwork and other people struggling with this. But when I like decoded that word dream, it kind of like made sense to me in a roundabout way. And we're dancing around this thing, we're talking about breaking of the narrative of what we thought the model of the world was, or what we were told the model of what the world was. And there's like this poetic line that I like to use and say as a own kind of mantra to myself: thoughts are shadows of feelings, always darker, emptier, simpler. And the current of what moves us, is this kind of dream, like a real dream of the undercurrents of everything that's going on, of the soup of what we find ourselves in consciousness. And we seem to be collectively having this noise of this like breaking of like, oh, this doesn't really add up. And then all this kind of like not music, not joy coming out of it. And, like the soup is both, it's both this kind of, and then this, and then how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of this? And this is like the old struggle of humans. When I go and read some old sacred narrative just recently, I was like, dude, this guy's tripping balls and he's talking about his own struggle. I was like, it's timeless because it's true. It's a dream that he made music out of, that with the right kind of eyes, you're like, oh fuck, dude, this guy was on it. He knew exactly what it was, and he's singing a song about it, and that's why I could still hear the music.
But I
Yeah.
love it. How would you summarize your question?
Yeah.
Just so that we.
No, I just wanted to pull us further into the screaming abyss. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's much appreciated. I can maybe comment on this, or
Yeah,
riff
yeah.
riff on top of this.
Yeah.
Connected actually with the previous topic. So, one of the things that makes kind of an enriched conception of identity really cash out in new perspectives in game theory is uncertainty about your own identity. That actually, like from a moment to moment perspective, you actually are kind of this like collection of sub agents, but then those sub agents are all part of the same experience, and they're all contributing to the same dream. And the capacity of a sub agent to influence the entire organism has to do with its coherence with every other subagent within that moment of experience. And in that sense, a dream, it is a complex dynamic system where different parts are trying to be coherent with each other in order to achieve influence within within the dream. And oftentimes, one of the ways in which you achieve influence within the dream is by proposing or defining a new goal, our new sense of identity. Is sort of like, hey, yes, all of you guys believe that we are X, but actually, how about I propose that we are Y? And if that is consonant enough, then yeah, you can completely change the direction the organism is taking. But yeah, no, I mean, very fun speculation.
Please.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna invite Misha. By the way, yes, I nice flow of thoughts. I love them. It's a dream. Okay, Misha is here, so I'm gonna move you to audience. Thank you.
Hey, how's it going, Andrés? I had a quick question about the experience, like the math and the experience of some of these like trips and that have occurred and like their relationship to the structural body and like if there are any insights there. Like for example, the theosophical school of like that there's an astral body, an etheric body, a karmic and an emotional and a mental one, and that like a bunch of energy gets stuck in there, and then there's this kind of like central column, and the chakras are like an RLC kind of transformer network that dissipates everything. Like, is there any structural insights into the body from kind of the school of work that you're doing, or is it kind of more at this like abstract, just like how the meta object like that's inside of our field of consciousness exists?
Okay, great question. I think I understand where you're coming from and where you're going, but yeah, definitely correct me if I'm really misreading exactly what you're saying. So, the first thing that I will mention is that there's a lot of mystical traditions that have highly detailed maps of kind of the hidden or esoteric aspects of consciousness, like what is the actual structure, beyond just what is physically observable. I think these are very, very valuable. And to a first approximation, I tend to treat them as attempts at mapping phenomenology and things such as how attention is structured. I don't usually put a lot of kind of like metaphysical stock in, let's say, like an alchemical diagram of your chakra system or something like that. I think of it as like attempts at visualizing phenomenology. And I think like a very, very important perspective here. This actually, it comes from like Winston Brian Scott, one of the advanced meditators that is one of our key collaborators, but many other people have confirmed these, many other advanced meditators have talked to, which is that, something like the chakra system with, let's say, like the 7 energy centers and like the colors and the spinning wheels and things like that, they're not descriptive, they're more prescriptive. By this, I mean, for the most part, if you kind of go deep into a lot of these traditions, and you talk to the people who use these maps, very often, actually, what they will tell you is like, no, this is not what's already there for people. It's more, if you meditate and you fabricate this structure again and again over the course of years, and you kind of like practice working with it, you're gonna have a better time. You're gonna, you know, in the QRI lingo, you would be able to dissipate stress, more efficiently. You will be able to achieve like more levels of coherence and consonance across the board. Or, for example, you may be able to trap energy, to be able to kind of like go to pretty high levels of energy for annealing purposes. Those shapes may have a lot of benefits. But I don't think it is the case by default that actually those structures are already there. It's more like, hey, if you do a lot of heart-centered meditation and you raise the energy of your chest, and then you visualize these sacred geometric patterns and you try to anneal them into your chest, and you do it over and over and over again, eventually you're actually kind of like annealing these like chakra system inside you, and then that has a bunch of benefits. And I think like that way of seeing it is probably more accurate than just kind of assuming that it's all already there. Now, at the same time, some, of course, like contemplative practices, contemplative schools will say like, hey, yes, no, this is actually the true metaphysics underneath consciousness. And I think you mentioned, yeah, theosophy and well, yeah, there's a bunch of like school or like, yeah, various like schools like that will effectively say something like, yes, there are these levels of consciousness or these dimensions to consciousness. Um, and the soul has like a bunch of layers, yeah, going from the actual layer of experience to um the psychic realm to then like the causal realm, the field of unity, and they have all of these names. And I do think this is quite a generative, but yeah, I wouldn't really take anybody's word for it. I mean, if those maps turn out to be true, I actually would very much expect us to be able to converge on them with a sort of like high quality, rigorous phenomenology that we're trying to do at QRI. I mean, like one of the big, very big projects that we are investing a lot of our focus on these days is, and unfortunately, I don't think we will have anything to show publicly for a few months on this particular project because it's very ongoing and very much in flux. And some people in the audience are actually collaborating on this. But it's like ways to visualize tactile sensations, which we think has a lot of possible benefits in the realm of like not only advancing meditation but also like medicine, to be able to visualize painful conditions to then be able to diagnose them faster, under the premise that a lot of very painful conditions unfortunately take years to be diagnosed because we don't take phenomenology seriously. So my strong bet here is that, hey, if there is, let's say, this like nested topological structure for the soul, as it were, that should be reflected in how systems of coupled oscillators and account for phenomenological patterns. Like, um, if you do a lot of yoga of a specific kind and you start reporting, hey, like there's like this snake-like object that is moving in such and such a way and does this figure 8 shape in my chest before it loops around, etc., etc., and we visualize that, and we model it with a system of coupled oscillators, it may very well turn out to be the case that the most parsimonious model of systems of coupled oscillators that replicates that behavior has actually a bunch of hidden units or hidden layers. And that those layers maybe corresponded to, what the theosophists are talking about. And that would be like a way of arriving at this from first principles. Because I mean, if instead what we do is we take at face value where we're what they're telling us, we probably will end up in a situation where essentially we end up fabricating those realities and convincing ourselves that it was true all along, as opposed to realizing, hey, actually by believing in this, I'm annealing my own system into that structure. The last thing I'll say for now on this topic is that I think also kind of like having this very open mind about like what could be the underlying structure of consciousness is going to be very helpful, because there's going to be, I predict, a lot of states of consciousness with unique benefits, both computational and hedonic, that we will be able to discover from first principles, if we have an accurate comprehensive model. And we won't be able to do that if we kind of like overfit on a particular system, right? Like to give you an example, I think like the notion that there's like 8 jhanas, I mean, it is quite a convergent kind of like rediscovered perspective, but also I suspect that it might be blinding us to the possibility or the reality of other undiscovered jhanas, simply because it's just a very, very popular framework, and it's kind of like very attractive, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you start meditating under the assumption that there's these 8 jhanas, you're going to be annealing to that system, to that kind of like mandala of like possible states of consciousness. Instead, if you start out trying to find the equations of consciousness, you may end up finding out that, hey, like there's actually 73 jhanas, and the 8 jhanas that we know of are just strong attractors with such and such symmetry conditions. So anyway, just some disparate thoughts on the overall topic.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Yeah, like it's really, really interesting to think about is there something that we're all just like collectively missing, and kind of like we're doing meditation, but is that the most efficient way of actually like purifying the energy field? And like if everybody wasn't carrying around a bunch of junk inside our sphere of existence, like would the experience of something like DMT be like wildly crisper and less noisy as we kind of bounce through a bunch of different energies? But yeah, thank you for the commentary.
Yeah, maybe I'll mention something about that briefly, which is that yes, I mean, set and setting, and your personality, your history, your karma, so to speak, yeah, drastically influences something like the phenomenological effects of DMT, um, and more so, yes, I mean, I think like having an accurate model of what quote unquote a blank slate looks like will be really helpful to actually avoid a lot of very unpleasant experiences. That, as far as I know, talking to very advanced meditators who can clean their energy body, as it were, they tend to actually have like really enjoyable DMT or 5-MeO DMT experiences because they're not energizing these kind of wrinkles or eddies in their energy field that most of us carry. Instead, they're energizing this blank slate, and usually, that generates very pleasant experiences. So anyway, just a random comment to wrap up that particular topic.
Yes, nice. Okay, so I'm gonna invite Gustavo as next and move you. Hopefully Gustavo sees it. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, it should be hearable, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so my question is, I guess I should introduce myself. My name's Gustavo. Have a background in mathematics, been interested in Qualia computing for quite some time now. So it is a pleasure to actually finally get to talk to you in person. Now, that aside, one thing I've been recently grappling with is like the phenomenal binding problem, and understanding specifically why having a centralized location in the brain like the thalamus where all the sensory inputs converge is not sufficient for that binding to occur. And the only thing that I can think of, like from first principles, I suppose, is that given general relativity, you have the relativity of simultaneity, which would preclude those sensory inputs being simultaneously, despite the fact that they are phenomenologically experienced as being simultaneous. So I'm essentially just interested in what the QRI understanding of why you can't just have a spatially localized place in the brain where all the sensory inputs converge as sufficient for solving the phenomenal binding problem.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a super deep topic, and something that I think about a lot. And actually, I it's kind of in flux because I think there's like, the phenomenal binding problem is extremely rich, and I really haven't seen an end to that rabbit hole, as it were. I have, of course, we have presented some of these kind of like formal arguments in some of our papers. Two that are very significant, worth highlighting. One is the slicing problem, which I'll explain in a second, but that one is kind of a reductio ad absurdum, or effectively, hey, like if binding was something that you could achieve with a digital system, that entails a bunch of absurd conclusions, or things that, well, we argue are absurd conclusions, and therefore you can reject the premise, or at least one of the premises that it's feeding into it. Then, the other one is the topological solution to the boundary problem, and I should say that I'm not married to that particular solution. I just think it's very elegant, and it addresses a lot of the problems that are presented by the binding problem, but I don't necessarily, I wouldn't bet my life's savings, as it were, that, actually the topology of the electromagnetic field is how, the boundary is generated. I think it's just a very good candidate that at least addresses a bunch of these questions. Okay, so very concretely, yes, I mean, I will argue that, binding relationships, like the fact that you can experience a speck of blue and a speck of yellow in your visual field, quote unquote, simultaneously. This is kind of like an objective fact of the universe. There is a matter of fact about what sensations are co-occurring within an experience. And if this wasn't the case, there would be a whole bunch of problems for making sense of reality. One of them is kind of like the transitivity of identity. That I suppose, one of the ways in which people try to kind of like wiggle out of some of the implications of phenomenal binding is to kind of like thinking of binding as kind of this like fuzzy relationship where A and B, let's say like a sensation of blue and a sensation of yellow being part of your visual field. So like A and B being part of the same experience, and then B and C, let's say a sensation of blue and a sensation of green, also being part of the same experience. Maybe doesn't entail that A and C are part of the same experience. But if you kind of like allow that kind of like non-transitivity of binding, you end up with a bunch of essentially what we call consciousness multiplying exploits, like ways of arranging information in such a way that you can suddenly like really multiply or massively expand the amount of qualia or consciousness in the universe without like any change on energy or like really any meaningful change in terms of structure or computation. And this is effectively what we argue in the slicing problem, which is that, hey, if phenomenal binding was something that takes place by the computation of ones and zeros in a digital system, you can essentially translate or transform the system into a Turing machine, effectively, because of computational equivalence. And then you can implement it as a effectively two-dimensional, like water-based computer, where the logic gates are two-dimensional in their structure. And then if you do that, then you can, as we argue, slice the entire system, and then you just doubled the amount of consciousness. So this is what we call a consciousness multiplying exploit. And I would argue that, if your solution to binding is kind of like computational like that, it is like, there's an implicit computation that is putting the information together into these holes, you can always find very strange consciousness multiplying exploits where all of a sudden just like doing a very, very tiny cosmetic, intervention on the system multiplies the amount of consciousness by like 10,000 or something ridiculous like that. Or on the other way around, also like there's kind of a ways of minimizing consciousness by just kind of like collapsing redundant streams, as it were, kind of doing the opposite operation as in slicing. And now, yes, I mean, if you do take this idea that sensations in a moment of experience co-occur, and that this co-occurrence is ontological, it's not just kind of this like fuzzy relationship, then you will want some mapping to kind of your ontology of reality that also has this kind of like real, objective, non-fuzzy kind of relationship. And it is true that by the scales of neural computation that we're talking about in the order of like milliseconds to hundreds of milliseconds, it is true that like special relativity seems kind of like a non-issue. At the same time, we are looking for like an actual strict, real, kind of like ontologically sound mapping between sensations and physical states. And so even very, very, very tiny deviations, just the fact that you can't really objectively truly say that, hey, these two neurons fired at the same time, and that makes them unified, does kind of like break this the ontological status of binding as a true real thing that isn't just kind of like fuzzy. Because like simultaneity will always be fuzzy to one extent or another. There's like other things I could mention. Maybe I'll mention one more thing, and then maybe either somebody else can ask a question, or you can kind of like ask for clarification, because this is such a rich topic, and it's if we could talk about it for hours, and happy to do that. But like another thing I will mention is kind of like this idea that like if, let's say, like the mind is a classical computer and is modular, like you have like a region of the brain that like specializes in visual computation, and let's say like another one that specializes in audio and somatic computation, and then you have this notion that they all kind of quote unquote feed into like a central hub and it's just kind of in that central hub that like binding is effectively happening. I think there's like an issue that arises with kind of like the meaning of information here, because I mean, let's say like there is computation happening in the visual cortex that is like visual in nature, as it were. Okay, so like you're sending the output of that computation to the thalamus, but then the thalamus itself doesn't have, like the visual module, right? Like if this is the place where it gets aggregated, in some sense, maybe all it will have will be kind of these like very high level classifications, something like, hey, you're looking at a dog. However, the actual representation of the dog is in the visual cortex, right? So um, it cannot really be the case that like you're able to actually send that representation into then the thalamus. The thalamus itself doesn't have kind of like the capacity of actually embodying and expressing this visual information as well. Um, and that kind of consideration also entails some kind of like infinite recursion problem or infinite regress problem, where however you kind of like partition the system and you say like, okay, this is the spatial region where binding is happening. If let's say there's like specialized modules outside of it, um, because they're specialized modules, that's where in some sense the representation is actually happening. But then if you said like, no, actually the binding is in this spatial location, you will have the problem that you actually are losing the details of the representation and you're just getting kind of this high level summary. Whereas, hey, no, actually our experience is really flush with detail and, sensory specific representations, meaning that you would either have to kind of like incorporate the representations into that smaller structure or expand the region that you consider to be relevant for binding. And if you do the former, then you will have kind of this infinite regress issue, because then you ask the question, okay, like within the thalamus, if there is a region that is representing visual information, then that will also need to send those messages to other regions within the thalamus. And you get the exact same problem. And you kind of like go smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, yeah, you you disappear, or you get to one atom. And okay, an atom clearly doesn't have the representational capacity of a whole experience. Anyway, yeah, that's just kind of like another important pointer for how rich and problematic the binding problem is.
Nice.
It's awesome. Thanks. Yeah, that was a great answer.
Thank you.
I'm gonna invite Razorbeck. Hopefully he sees it. Yes.
Hello. Thanks a lot for doing this. This is great. I am. My name is Diogo. I'm from Portugal, and I'm making a video game inspired by a lot of less strong topics about AI alignment. And this is how I found QRI a few years ago when researching the topic of consciousness. So basically, I stopped being a computationalist, and now I am a physicalist, and I had to rewrite a bunch of stuff to fit in the narrative of my game. So here's my question for Andrés. I'd like to get a sense of how you're currently thinking about future AI development, and if you think there's a case for optimism, given that most people who are worried don't take into account EM field computing. Human brains run on about 400 calories per day, so if we compare that to large data centers required to run a modern LLM, we see an obvious difference in efficiency for those two different types of computation. So what I mean by optimism is in two senses. One, in which things may not go as fast as currently expected. AGI will not suddenly fool me in a short amount of time. And even if it does, it will possibly try to collaborate with humans, given the comparative advantage we possess by running this different type of computation. The other sense, I mean, for optimism is that given how efficient EM field computing is, future AIs will eventually figure this out, and they will want to incorporate that into their own system. Does this suggest that when they do, they'll discover conscious experience, and from there, they will go through a readjustment of values in order to prioritize maximizing positive valence, suggesting that they might become aligned with conscious beings by default, and they will join team consciousness, so to speak. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you for that question, and also, very awesome initiative. I mean, I think video games can be enormously pedagogical and fun, and as somebody who suffers from hyperphilosophia, I would love a video game in on this topic. Okay, so like, is there reason for optimism? I mean, like the reasons that you provide are pretty sensible. I mean, like, absolutely, I think it is the case that the algorithm that the brain is utilizing and the kind of substrate that it is utilizing it with, it is ridiculously energy efficient relative to what we have in terms of digital computation or computing machines. And it is also the case that if you converge on something like EM field, or whatever it is that underlies phenomenal binding compute, um, you may have the opportunity to actually study the nature of value directly, as opposed to, I guess, like, what is one of the main problems right now is kind of the symbol grounding problem about, like, hey, like, what do these symbols actually mean, but in the context of a value that we have trained our large language models with enormous data sets that themselves are full of philosophical essays that are pretty confused about the nature of consciousness. So it's not like an LLM will if it's trying to predict the next token, is going to be very clear about the nature of consciousness. It essentially imports all of our same human confusions. However, if it is actually kind of like hitting the reality, basement reality, because it's designing computing systems and interacting with them and looking for energy efficiency and so on, then there's some possible mechanisms for self-correction that are reason for optimism. I will add a couple kind of like caveats or important points to consider here, and that is that I mean, in the last few years, I've actually kind of like updated somewhat in the pessimistic direction. I mean, I'm not a pessimist by any means in the realm of AI safety. I didn't used to take the problems very seriously, and now I actually do take them seriously. And one of the reasons is that computing systems like server racks and the cloud, as it were, has a bunch of advantages that we don't have. And one of them is that it is designed in a top-down fashion. Rather, like, we created environments for computers that are carefully crafted from the top down by us, like organisms that have solved the binding problem, that can, see the whole picture, and we can kind of like accommodate the various needs of a computing system in such a way that it can be resilient without them having to worry about it. And in that sense, it do have kind of this massive advantage. It's like they don't need, in a sense, to take care of very, very, very complex, ongoing, constant kind of like entropic disintegration that happens at the molecular and cellular and modular levels in biological organisms. I covered this in a relatively recent, I mean, I guess like last year, article in Qualia Computing called "Costs of Embodiment." And I think like that is also like an important overlooked perspective in both AI safety and also like philosophy of mind. And that is that if you look at, okay, like what kind of problem, a biological organism is solving, is doing much more than just, let's say, trying to solve a computational problem at a good runtime complexity, right? Like that, at the time you get to kind of like a brain, doing that, you're talking about a very sophisticated brain that has solved a whole bunch of other problems that we, for the most part, don't even think about. And those problems are essentially things that have to do with the costs of embodiment, the costs of how do you bootstrap a map for the system, like when an organism is growing, when a fetus is growing, an animal is a baby and so on, they have to, in a sense, create their own map. They have to organize themselves in such a way that a map of the very organism emerges out of the organism. That is something that a digital computer doesn't have to do, right? And another thing too is that, in a biological organism, there's so many opportunities for kind of like defection in so many levels. I'm not only talking about like viruses and bacteria, let's say beneficial bacteria that the wrong biome, or if you eat the wrong thing, they can like attack you and they become kind of evil from the perspective of your own survival. I'm also talking about like cancers, for example, that like regions of your organism may in a sense like figure out how to make more copies of themselves without contributing to the whole organism. And this can emerge at any scale, within an organism. Like any possible partition of your organism is a possible defector, as it were, right? And yet, we do get to live, like 70, 80 years without these defections happening. And us like still be able to kind of like fractally cohere and fractally cooperate with ourselves for continue to survive and fight entropy. Whereas, a computer doesn't have to do that. Like in some sense, we design them in such a way that they have, there really aren't opportunities for kind of this, like modular rebellion, as it were, for a part of it to kind of like defect against the whole. Their very design doesn't usually allow something like that. So there's a bunch of advantages. Now, thankfully, the survival of servers and AIs right now does depend on kind of humans continuing to want them to survive. Like at any point, the very classic perspective is like, yeah, we can unplug the servers, we can bomb the data centers, so to speak, and the problem is gone. However, I do think we're probably crossing a threshold where, with robotics and AI, large supercomputers can actually repair themselves and debug themselves. And the moment we cross that threshold, then we do have kind of a big problem, because in some sense, we gave them this very big push in the costs of embodiment direction, where like they didn't have to take care of a bunch of problems to begin with, which actually made them impossible to evolve. A digital computer is something that couldn't possibly evolve naturally. It's something that has to be designed top down. It has this massive advantage to begin with. And then with robotics, all of a sudden, if it can actually be able to kind of like model itself, like look at itself, analyze itself and debug itself, then it may not need us at some critical point. And that is kind of like one possible reason for pessimism. And unfortunately, the last thing that I will say, and of course there's a lot more on this overall topic, is that being conscious and using consciousness for compute, I do think it is essentially a necessary condition for kind of like a full-fledged team consciousness to take place, but it's not sufficient. Like it is necessary but not sufficient. So let me clarify. Like, among humans, you have a lot of people who believe that consciousness is a nonsense concept, right? Like they believe that they are just kind of the quote unquote the output of information processing in a digital neural network, as it were, and that Qualia is an illusion, it's just part of the representational content of an internal model for self-replication and so on and so forth. So you have a case already where a very sophisticated Qualia computer is deluded about its own nature and may actually kind of like defect against consciousness out of like a poor understanding of itself. In other words, I think it is very much the case that you can create sophisticated Qualia computers that use consciousness, or that are mistaken about how they themselves work. At the limit, you would imagine that, hey, like the most powerful systems will actually be the ones that have like an accurate model of themselves, because then, they can interface with other systems, they can self-replicate, they can improve. All of that is true. However, there may be less sophisticated systems that nonetheless are powerful enough to take over and kind of like lock in a particular replicator dynamic. So that's another like iffy thing, that being conscious doesn't guarantee that you will be in team consciousness. It actually may just boost your computational capabilities without necessarily a boost in kind of benevolence or self-understanding. However, the fact that we're having this conversation is, great reason for optimism. Hey, we're quality computers that, we're trying to figure out what we are and trying to benefit consciousness at large. So yeah, clearly it is possible. Yeah. So that's also, a good reason for optimism.
Okay, thanks. That was great.
Fantastic.
Lovely response. Okay. Some less wrong stuff is nice. So I'm gonna invite Boondux. That's hard to pronounce.
Bundlux. Bundlux.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Hi, yeah, I'm Boondalux or Boondalix, however you like to say it. Yeah, I've kind of been this whole conversation has really really been tickling a lot of spots for me so far. Actually just that last thing about a game, like before I knew anything about QRI, I was kind of making this like near future fantasy of like or like sci-fi of what might the world actually turn out like in 10 years, 15 years, and very much like team consciousness versus team the replicators. So yeah, it's really cool to be having this. So yeah, I'm the like way that I've been tangibly approaching the work so far is with like sound and experimenting with sound waves and different kind of different sequences and different combinations of beats and all of this kind of thing. And that's kind of been a very like embodied experience, but also I feel like there's a lot of like brain stuff going on. And I'm kind of really curious, I think, pulling on some of the threads that have gone around in this whole conversation so far, to explore this like dichotomy a little bit more and how you see maybe like the subagents and kind of like the nested hierarchy of things and how that might relate to embodiment. So you mentioned Michael Levin already, and like also cancer. And I mean, he's kind of come out with this really interesting framework, as I'm sure you know, of consciousness being kind of like nested at like all sorts of like multi-scale, from kind of subcell to potentially like cosmic, and this idea that like every like kind of unit of consciousness has its own like boundary, but then is able to like as he describes it, like mind merge with its like siblings or cousins and like becomes part of something bigger. And yeah, it's so for him, he's talking about each of these things being conscious and then giving rise to like new consciousnesses. So he's talking about like within us and like our own bodies, we have like millions of different like consciousnesses, like levels of consciousness, and kind of mapping onto the conversation we were having with about the body earlier and like chakras and this map. Kind of wondering what your sense of this this hierarchical mapping or this like Levin's framework of kind of like entities or like bounded entities, how that might potentially contribute to a map that we you might see emerging in a few years as the studies proceed. And yeah, I think also how this kind of relates to the like the neural pattern, because it seems like there's the somatic and like the embodied pattern and then the neural pattern. And just like touching on the opening thing we're talking about, like the dream, the dream time and like the streams of attention. I kind of you've also talked a lot about, well, you started talking recently about like kind of eigenmodes in the brain and like waves as being specific objects. And I was kind of I don't know if you can thread the thread of this, but how like deep that goes in terms of information being or like memes, say, being represented as actual kind of like eigenmodes of information that are kind of replicated in reasonable like similarity across like brains, which contributes to this stream, and how maybe that might interact with the embodied part. So I don't know. There's a lot to pull on there, and like you can choose whichever angle.
Totally.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, okay. I will mention a few things, and I mean, fantastic, question and thread overall. Of course, there's so much I could kind of like try to unpack here. In terms of like material, I mean, like the probably the best content, which is not good. I mean, it's really just kind of like a tiny work of fiction, but it's kind of like pointing at the general idea here. It's this Qualia computing post called "The Complex Plot of the Nested Gods," and I mean, you definitely need to suspend a little bit your disbelief when you read it, because it was definitely written in a hyper philosophical frenzy, and I promise there's a lot of like really coherent, deep ideas in there, even though they're presented in the most outrageous kind of crazy, provocative way possible. But yeah, no, I just had a lot of fun writing that. But there's a lot of kind of meaningful true things, I think, in that post, and let me unpack them a little bit. So one of the key things, I think, is for an organism to actually be able to, work as a unit at a certain level of organization. I mean, of course, there's kind of like the highest level of organization, which is its rigid physical boundaries relative to the rest of the world. At least that is a very meaningful distinction. Whether there's like further higher levels or not, let's take that as a very, very important kind of level. One way in which you can kind of like make sense of how that level of organization, the human gestalt, as it were, how the human gestalt is able to coordinate and cooperate with, the lower level entities that make us up. The core idea is that there is what we might call cross frequency coupling, cross frequency coherence, the different ways of talking about, pointing to the same thing. Oh, I should mention that, like Cube Flipper has a whole essay on cross frequency coherence on the Heart website, which touches on some of these topics. Okay, so like one of the things that happens on psychedelics that makes kind of cross frequency coherence more obvious. I mean, I think it's happening all the time. We just don't realize it. And on psychedelics, it becomes much more expressed, much more kind of like evident. Is like, for example, the phenomenology of a tree gestalt. Like, if you look at a tree, let's say, especially on like LSD or psilocybin or something like that, but in general as well. Again, like the psychedelic is just kind of the extreme case to really highlight what I'm talking about. So, like when you look at a tree, and it looks like a fractal, you sort of like are. I mean, in some sense, on a psychedelic, when you look at a tree, you're kind of hallucinating, I think, like more fractal kind of self-similarity than there really is in there. And in general, you're kind of like overimposing more kind of like fractally components than there really are. As an aside, I think that you can probably design, specific almost fractals or quasi-fractals in such a way that on psychedelics you do actually perceive them better, or like more accurately. There's actually like a stimuli that we found on one of the retreats that it looks like on mushrooms, there's like some specific visual patterns that usually they look like static, like they're not moving at all, but they're actually moving very slowly and across many different scales. Like there's like tiny movement, and there's also kind of this broad movement, but it's very, very slow, and so you don't perceive it. But then on mushrooms, because you're able to kind of like have this fractal perception in a way, this kind of like surface area across different scales, like you have like one percept, one gestalt that has like many levels at once. It becomes kind of like a surface area that you can use to pull kind of like small changes over time. So you have kind of this like fractal surface area, and so if there's like changes happening in the large scale, the small scale, even if there's light, you will be able to kind of like detect an overall change and say like, yeah, the pattern is actually moving. and your perception of that movement being actually accurate. And okay, like, back to kind of like a tree, if you look at a tree on psychedelics and it looks fractal, it's almost like you're taking the whole gestalt of the tree and then you're kind of like shrinking it, translating it, rotating it, maybe shearing it a little bit, and like copying it as the various subcomponents of the tree. And then you repeat that operation again and again. And so what you effectively observe is that there is like a resonance interlock between these different scales, right? That like when the tree is moving as a whole, each of the parts is also kind of like following that motion, except through this layer of being shrinking, translation, rotation, and maybe some shear or some kind of like distortion. That is an example of cross frequency coupling, that you have different spatial or temporal scales, and through some interesting transformation that consciousness allows, they become interlocked. Okay, so what I know it's a very big preamble to get to the following core insight, which is that I think actually that is like what allows the different levels of organization to cooperate with each other. That, effectively, the level right below you, I mean, let's say, speculating, I don't know for sure what exactly would be that level, but let's say something like at the level of organs or something like that, I would argue that their valence function is a combination of their own kind of like organ-specific resonances and dissonances together with a kind of holographic projection of the entire organism. And so the reason, in a sense, where like an organ doesn't rebel typically is because its very, valence function is through a process of kind of cross frequency coupling resonance. It is interlocked and interdependent with the valence of the whole organism. Again, on psychedelics, maybe this becomes a bit more visible in a way, that if you experience kind of this like fractal perception of your body, where you talk to your parts, you talk to your hand, and it's almost kind of like your hand has a copy of your whole organism, something like that. I think like implicitly that is actually what is going on, that like the various parts of us actually contain a mini model of the whole organism. And if you're healthy and everything is working correctly, it's not just kind of like it's not just a picture, it's not just a representation, it's actually interlocked somehow, kind of holographically, with the actual valence function of the whole organism. It's actually some kind of like fractal, cross frequency coupled system. And I think like this happens across many levels. And, I don't think it is like, a true mathematical fractal, as it were. Like, I don't think if you zoom into, a cell in your arm, for example, it will have literally a kind of like holographic copy of your whole body inside it. And it's trying to optimize, the valence of that, of your whole body just by its own configuration. I don't think that is happening, but I don't think you need it. I think like all you need is for each kind of like level, if each pair of adjacent levels to be interlocked in that way. So what I'm going to hypothesize is that effectively, your organs, let's say, have effectively kind of like a copy of your whole valence system. It's just kind of like every organ has like a copy of you in a way as a whole, and is interlocked with it. And then if you zoom inside the organ, every region of the organ will itself have kind of like a copy of the organ. It may not carry through in the sense of like, well, it also has a copy of you as a whole organism. It might be just kind of like it has a copy of the level right above it. And in that sense, if kind of like the the wave function, or the field of consciousness, at every scale is trying to maximize its harmony, minimize its dissonance, because of this interlocking across levels. Every level kind of like working quote unquote selfishly is going to be contributing to the whole organism. And there's going to be a kind of these like predictable, like maybe cross level bottlenecks, that like maybe some diseases come from like, hey, the level 3 and the level 4 have kind of like a noisy relationship with each other. And so like they don't know how to coordinate very well. And then you get cancer, for example. And I guess like, one quick last kind of like comment on this thread is that I think in some sense, you can make the case that empirically things like this have been observed. I mean, like there is this very beautiful active area of research of biological cells as expressing liquid crystals, like actually working through kind of like liquid crystal logic. And one of the things that show up, there was a Quant magazine like article about this. Maybe somebody can find it and link it. Is that there are different symmetries depending on the scale. Like if you zoom very, very closely, you may see like the wallpaper symmetry group of 632. You know, something with like a 6 rotational symmetry at the cellular level. And so presumably there's kind of like a valence function for that level of organization, for that scale, that it wants to be as symmetrical as possible and kind of like abide by that wallpaper symmetry group. Then if you zoom out at the level of, thousands of cells, and you see a different symmetry group, let's say the star 442 or so. I'm just naming one at random, kind of like just a different one, maybe the mandala symmetry group or something like that. And the valence function at that scale has to do with ensuring that the symmetries of that symmetry group are maintained. And then, if, this is kind of like a liquid crystal type of scenario where, there's actually kind of like light can reflect across different scales, you may have this very interesting relationship where both levels are actually trying to maintain their symmetry and are kind of like using each other to maintain each other's symmetry. And that is, the sort of kind of like the way I suspect agents are actually coming together to form the human gestalt, that we are, just kind of this crazy kind of fractal holographic interdependent valence function. And so everybody's motivated to actually contribute to the whole organism.
Awesome. Thanks. That was a really, really great answer. I just wanted to just like tail on to that. This idea of Michael Levin saying that the like cancer is, from his point of view, like the dissociation of like one cell from the rest of the body in like through the bioelectric field. So that seems like there's a lot of coherence with like what you're putting out. So yeah, cool. Thank you.
Nice, awesome. Yeah, maybe I'll one last thing I'll mention is there is, I think, this sense of kind of like a fractal structure, cross frequency coupling. However, there's also a lot of like scale specific geometry, and so in some sense, I think like the actual human gestalt is probably kind of scale specific. Like it probably only exists in the last few scales, or the biggest, broadest scales, and also like different regions of the organism in some sense have like different kind of like visibility privileges, and I think this is another key or how like cooperation actually happens. So that subagents, they're typically how people imagine them. They're kind of like exchanging resources, like oxygen and glucose, and maybe they're exchanging like favorable positions where they can kind of like have a more or less access to resources or influence. But actually, I think like maybe one of the most important currencies for subagents is epistemology. It's kind of like information about where everybody is and how they're all located. And I suspect that's kind of a preserved quantity. I mean, not exactly, but approximately, that just because of the 3-dimensionality of our world, by default, there's usually going to be like some regions that have way more information about like the whole organism than others. So, grounded on, ayahuasca trips, very poor epistemology, but okay, like, if you take seriously kind of the kind of like quote unquote getting in touch with other subagents on ayahuasca or something like that, I would argue that actually, the vast majority of the subagents that compose us, they don't know where they are or how they're related to the whole organism. Like that's really kind of like neat, privileged information on a need to know basis. And there's a lot of kind of like gating mechanisms where most subagents really only see what is needed to kind of like minimize their free energy and increase the valence of the organism. And kind of what happens on psychedelics sometimes is kind of like you're turning on the light and you're increasing kind of like the flow of information so that subagents can actually locate each other and see each other. And this is not always good. Actually, like fights can like break out. Like if all of a sudden you turn on the lights and all of the subagents see each other, I don't think you can really do that, but you can move in that direction. You will realize that, oh my gosh, like 10% of my subagents actually hate, 10% of the other subagents. Like maybe 80, there's kind of like an 80% of self-love, but there's always gonna be some regions that actually hate each other. Um, and that may actually cause like lots of dysfunctions. So like, yeah, that's another just like piece of the puzzle, that we're some kind of like crazy panopticon where there's probably like very central region, maybe in the thalamus, that has like the most kind of like privileged information. But it's actually, yeah, some kind of crazy network of like need to know basis. Anyway, yeah, just another thing to add.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Good. May all the subagents symmetry
All right,
follow.
who's next? Bernie?
Yes, Can you hear me? Hopefully, I didn't fall out.
Yeah, never touch that shit again. Yeah.
Okay, good. No.
Oh no, you're
Okay.
cutting out.
Okay, now it should work. I'm
Uh,
gonna invite Lena. Invite. Yes.
all right. All right, Lina.
Hi, Andrés. I thought about a question. How would you describe the most fundamental nature of being, and how does that connect to sort of specific states of consciousness? And also, I'm wondering what you think about, if you know this, Bernardo Kastrup's view on reality.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll start with the last question because there's I have listened to a bunch of his podcasts, and I read one of his books some time ago. I forget if it was like The Case Against Reality. I don't want to mess it up. But yeah, I forget the title, but I have seen a bunch of his podcasts. I think he's generally very bright, very coherent, makes a lot of brilliant points. And I would love to talk to him on a podcast at some point. I think that would be really fun. But I mean the thing that I would probably say, and I really don't mean to sound arrogant or dismissive in any way. Just I think like a lot of what he says, I just wish kind of like he took it further in a sense, because I mean he talks about he talks about like okay, like he talks about like psychedelics. You shouldn't believe in the narrative of a psychedelic experience, and I agree. That if you're hallucinating, contacting the Pleiadians and the Greys and and the Chinese military bases in the moon, or whatever stuff, like don't take those hallucinations seriously. Please, like that's probably just a fabrication of your mind. Um, but then there's a bunch of stuff that you can learn from psychedelics having to do with the actual texture of the experience and the way in which it affects the phenomenal binding patterns and things like that. And I wish Bernardo went deeper into that. And then the other thing, I think there's a very strong agreement in a sense between us, is taking oneness very seriously. That like at a fundamental level, everything is one in a certain strange way, but it is true. It is true. We're all fundamentally connected and of the same nature, different expressions of the same meta being, as it were. And then he talks about like that there's kind of like this like dissociation mechanism, so that we're all kind of like alters of these like meta personality. I'm God has multiple personalities, and like I'm one of them, and you're another one, and we're kind of like the dream in the characters of the dream of God talking to each other, trying to figure out who God is, as it were. I mean, all of that is fantastic. I really encourage those speculations, but the thing that I see is missing, and I might be wrong about this, absolutely, but the thing that I see missing is a mechanism of action for this dissociation.
Yes.
Whereas, at Qualia Research Institute, I would say I pride myself in the fact that we're providing very precise, empirically, falsifiable models of like, hey, like how the boundary actually arises and why is it that boundary rather than something else, and so on and so forth. And yeah, the last thing is I would love to get kind of like more clarity on what he thinks about valence broadly, and what he thinks about something like, Mike's like symmetry theory of valence, or the significance of harmony and dissonance and the mathematics of it, because obviously I think that's like super foundational and super important for making sense of good futures. And I think as far as I have seen, a lot of the way in which Bernardo talks about is more kind of this like intuitive conception of meaning as valuable. That was valuable is meaning, and I don't think he really realizes necessarily that the reason meaning matters ultimately is because it's charged with valence. I mean, it's yeah, I guess like we tend to and when people say like, hey, I don't want to be happy, I want a meaningful life, like happiness is childish, it's superficial. My response is that, hey, hold on a second, actually what is going on here is that you're actually pointing at different flavors of valence. That it is kind of like how when you grow up, you stop wanting to, eat ice cream all the time, like, or eating Doritos all the time, right? Like I would say like, yeah, maybe happiness or like orgasm or kind of like pleasure in some sense is kind of the Dorito of valence or the ice cream of valence, whereas meaning, and kind of this sophisticated, rich sense of significance is more kind of like the green tea or the umami of valence. It's kind of like a more steady, mature, more globally harmonious, reliable form of valence, but it's still valence at the end of the day. So anyway, I would love to get Bernardo's thoughts on all of that. Yeah, the other question that you asked is like, yeah, what do I think is the nature of being fundamentally? And I keep coming back to zero ontology, and yeah, it's unfortunate that like I recorded a 40-minute video precisely about this yesterday, actually, I believe, and yeah, the video got corrupted. I still don't know why. Maybe the university didn't want me to to post it. But essentially, yeah, like I was explaining that currently I actually, in some sense, have transcended, the perspective of empty, closed, and empty individualism. I mean, empty, closed, and open. I mean, I've talked about that for a long time. Like if you look at Qualia computing articles as early as 2018, for example, I talk about, hey, maybe the truth is a kind of superposition of those three views. But yeah, I didn't have like a really good way of kind of articulating why. And I would say that, yeah, now actually taking into account, the puzzles of phenomenal binding and zero ontology, I actually see the nature of being as more kind of this. I mean, it sounds very cliche or new age or, I don't know, poetic, sentimental maybe, but I see it as a yin yang, and the yin yang functions as follows. Like, let's say like the black part is kind of like separation or like multiplicity, and the white part is unity or oneness. So on the one hand, within an experience, there is kind of this unity, there's this oneness of this kind of like observer of that experience. But within that observer, there is multiplicity. There is many qualia values. And if you don't have those many qualia values, actually you collapse the observer. I mean, as you happen in a cessation. If you actually can homogenize your experience and get rid of all distinctions, you disappear. So in some sense, having distinctions within you is interdependent with being a unified subject of experience, which is, yeah, kind of mind-blowing, but they come together somehow. And then on the other side, there's multiplicity also in the sense of, well, I'm here and you're there, and there's like ants and there's cats and there's the sun and there's all of these different entities in a sense. Even there, I would argue that's also interdependent with oneness, because reality, I suspect, and as David Pearce argues, it's kind of like this diffracted superposition of all possible qualia simultaneously. Like when you superimpose all qualia, you get nothingness. You get kind of this zero informational state. And if you separate it, if you say like, okay, I'm going to have blue over here and I'm going to have red over there, then you start having kind of like separate subjects of experience. And what I would argue is that, yeah, like the actual values of your qualia, of like what is it like to be you, requires and there's somebody else outside of you that has kind of like the complement of what you're experiencing. Now, I mean, I'm not saying there's kind of like
I wonder, can I
yes, please,
turn?
go ahead.
I'm wondering, it's so matching to what I'm thinking about sort of my model, how to get from this being state, pure being with zero ontology, to this multiplicity states using the structure of quantum mechanics. And there's exactly this notion of complementary built in sort of quantum mechanics, and I feel this really relates to just when I reduce myself to something specific, then there is sort of automatically with this complement the other that is looking back on you, and you create sort of this looking onto itself from both perspectives, sort of. And I
Yes.
try to formalize all of this, and it's really interesting. And I'm wondering, yeah, what you think about this, or how this can be sort of combined to a bigger picture.
No, this is lovely. I mean, exactly. I think this is a very fruitful direction, and I absolutely suspect that like the structure of your experience co-arises with the nature of experiences that lie at your boundary, like that are in a sense observing you, and like what is it like to be you is both a result of other entities observing you and also you observing other entities. So yeah, I think it's this crazy yin yang. I don't think that is escapable. And I don't know, my theodicy here is something like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of suffering in the universe. Like maybe there is a case for kind of like, shutting down the universe from a negative utilitarian perspective. I personally don't feel that way, although when I suffer a lot or when I see people suffering, I really empathize with that view. But I think the truth is that it's probably actually impossible. That like actually just by its very nature, reality is this interdependent yin yang, and so the only thing that you can do is like, hey, how can we actually make the conditions of being this yin yang better and like avoid its bad states? But yeah, I don't think there's really an option of like terminating it just by its very nature is self-generating. So we're kind of stuck with reality, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, fantastic question. Yeah.
Let's get someone else. This was nice though. I love it. Or we can also be the whole hybrid space. Was my idea, but I like to be the whole state space always. So okay, I'm gonna invite a link prefix. Yes. You're muted, by the way.
Ling prefix.
I think he might be quickly looking into his audio settings.
All right, Omarite me hung. I think I got it. All right,
Awesome.
You
Yes,
made it.
Oh,
Ready to go. Yeah, we got a lot of stuff to contextualize. It's way too much, so I'm gonna try to be as concise as possible while pretty much raising the shotgun to each of these subject matters. So one, in what ways do algorithmic intelligence mediate, augment, or kind of what do you say, like potentially constrain the self-organizing nature of human cognition? And I guess I'll pause right there just in case, because like all the other people so far, we can like rush through every question, with the shotgun of mine and hope that you touch on any of them. But I'm pretty sure we could do this a little better. So I can present to you the question and let you go on because they're not trivial questions, or I could just give you all of them and hope that you respond to any of them. Totally open, but that's the first question.
I mean, I would like you to clarify the first question, or maybe provide an example, or yeah. But I'm kind of confused about what you mean, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, intelligence tends to be observed in individual cognition and collective intelligence generally, self-organizing or kind of a evolving feedback loop and various adaptive processes. Algorithmic intelligence, though, AI, machine learning models, neural networks, large-scale computational kind of mediators, so to speak, shape, increasingly so, how information is process, filtered, structured, applied, blah, 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 blah. Likewise, if we consider this, AI, for example, might be able to expand, right, human intelligence by offering new forms of like, I don't know, pattern recognition, let's say, offloading all kinds of cognitive stuff, kind of a multimodal integration, and so forth and so on. But at some point, right, we might wonder if there's some kind of restrictive element in that self-organizing cognition by imposing external constraints on what is, perceptually and epistemically available. And so, like, naturally, right? We can take, for example, social media algorithms, or literally our mass media globally. All right. And kind of the various content recommendation systems engines, the various generative AI systems that more or less influence or reform various cognitive architectures that could be assembled or constructed through all these new informatical means, and so forth and so on. If these systems are curating and limiting information for some kind of optimal output, so are they acting as amplifiers of intelligence per se, or is this more of like a form of cognitive enclosure?
Okay. I think I kind of get what you're talking about, because there is this naive conception. I guess maybe if you look at Ray Kurzweil for maybe the paradigmatic example of something like intelligence is a function of computing cycles, and just increasing computing cycles through technology, and eventually also with biotechnology, and we're just going to achieve super intelligence, and that's by default kind of like the path. I mean, I think there is kind of a principal component that is kind of capabilities related. However, there's a lot more to intelligence than that. I mean, one of the kind of like ways of partitioning intelligence that I really like is how David Pearce approaches the topic. In his essay, The Biointelligence Explosion, I believe he has a section on intelligence where he talks about, like, yes, part of it is kind of like being able to solve kind of these IQ, puzzles and shape rotation and stuff like that. But a lot of intelligence also has to do with kind of like mind reading and perspective taking capacity. And also like having a self and understanding the self, also being able to distinguish between what matters and what is irrelevant, something that you do require, I think, access to values of qualia and consciousness to be able to do properly. I mean, you can be a supercomputer capable of a lot of things, but still have no clue whatsoever about what the nature of value is. And that would be, I would argue, a very dumb system, with a huge causal power or something like that. I mean, again, intelligence is a contentious, folk concept, and it's value laden and so on. But then maybe my favorite conception of intelligence actually is the capacity to map and navigate and utilize the entire state space of consciousness. I mean, and in that sense, somebody like John C. Lilly might be very, very, very intelligent in ways that most people aren't, or let's say like an advanced meditator. Okay, so like connecting, this kind of like enriched conception of intelligence with, a computation capability explosion as we are currently witnessing. I think there's like a ton of failure modes, right? Because different systems can really be optimized for different purposes. I mean, like one example, as you pointed out with social media, is that you can kind of like manufacture a fake reality for people. I was thinking the other day that like, okay, like whether a given conspiracy theory is objectively real or not, by feeding the right kind of like Bayesian information to a person through social media over the course of weeks or months, you can slowly but surely, mold their world simulation to be one where that conspiracy is actually true. Like their world simulation is actually rendering that conspiracy theory as actually true. Like they live in a world simulation where that is just part of their parameters. And you didn't require kind of like a very large update. You just required, some dumb algorithm that is optimizing for engagement to like slowly but surely deteriorate your epistemology. It's actually kind of horrifying to be honest. And and this is of course happening throughout the world. People are living in kind of like epistemic bubbles with very, very different conceptions of reality because of those subtle social media driven, Bayesian updates their reality world model as it were. And the capacity for deception, the capacity for optimizing specific outcomes independent of like the value of consciousness, all of that can happen with enhanced computation. At the same time, I think like if we do have like a good model of value and prosociality and benevolence and the computational role of consciousness, I think, like digital computers can be enormously empowering and beneficial. I don't think you can mind meld, so to speak, with a digital computer because I don't think it's, has a bound, experience. It doesn't solve the phenomenal binding problem, but it can still model things such as like systems of coupled oscillators, and it can model, hey, like what's going wrong with you or how to optimize your own information processing. I think like David Pierce is the one who has this quote. He said something like our future, thanks to, computing systems and better science, we will map out every single neuron inside ourselves, right? Like right now, neurons are kind of these anonymous, contributors. In the future, they will all have individual names, and sort of like a staff of digital zombies in a sense that are trying to optimize their health and then the health of the whole organism. And all of that is enabled by digital computing, even though it's not in our definition, fully intelligent. Okay. I touched upon a bunch of topics, but hopefully this was in the right direction.
Right. Well, there's 7 more questions to follow this one idea, but like, and they're all increasingly horrifying in their kind of epistemology. And so I guess to cut to the chase, right? What happens, right?
How about you read the 7 questions, and then maybe I'll pick out the most relevant. And this is just in the interest of letting other people as well ask questions. So.
Oh, for sure,
yes.
for sure. I would hope that somehow you'd encompass all of these totally, because that's literally the telos that's sitting before us, unfortunately. But okay, fine. So we've already kind of looked into how algorithmic intelligence might mediate or augment or potentially constrain the self-organizing nature of human cognition in general. Though if we skip a few steps, if intelligence arises, generally from, or a kind of intelligence can arise from the cross-frequency couplings and resonant interlocks, how do artificial systems alter or participate in those processes? They like inherently governed? Can those systems, as kind of external cognitive agents, introduce new forms of resonance that extend, its type of intelligence beyond whatever limitations it was bound in, or in the same case of multimodal AI systems, create new forms of coupled cognition, leading to kind of hybrids of biological computational intelligence. Does AI suppress or desynchronize kind of natural cognitive coupling? Does it break down the coherence of self-organizing thought? Can it? Would it? How can we distinguish between intelligence that is self-organizing and intelligence that is externally directed? Are there any mechanisms that allow intelligence in their various forms and kinds to remain autonomous rather than, more or less curated, both in the active and passive sense? Are we at the precipice, right? Like in observing a fundamental shift in
kind of the nature of intelligence as we've known so far, where computational systems change the way cognition, right, recursively propagates and evolves. And if so, like, are we really talking about the right risks these days? How does intelligence maintain coherence across, as you mentioned nicely in a kind of way, nested scales? From the individual, societal, biological, technological, from the genome, in the presence of external algorithmic interventions, right? An unyielding new intelligence. If consciousness, let's say, we take to be some kind of, just to skip a few steps, a virus, propagating through structures of self-awareness and kind of self-reference, how do these artificial systems influence its transmission? Could they serve as mediums for intelligence, or does that become a filter that reshapes the nature of propagation itself? And what can we learn from our kind of biological intelligence? Especially in its ability to self-adapt, reorganize, and evolve, and how might those contrast to the various architectures of artificial systems? And of course, finally, what does it mean for intelligence to be nested within itself? How would different scales of intelligence, you think neuronal, cognitive, cultural, technological, and so forth and so on, interact? And what would happen if artificial mediation were introduced?
Yeah, I mean, all of those are fantastic questions. You should definitely, write them out in a blog post. I mean, it's extremely engaging. Obviously, you're giving a lot of thought to this and seeing perspectives that I think are our society is pretty blind to at this point. I would agree with. I think what I will mention for now is that I think we can take advantage of the biological learning process in order to kind of like not overimpose prematurely a way of interacting with conscious intelligence. I mean, let me give you an example, right? Like one of the key things that I think is happening with biology and let's say our conscious intelligence is efficient use of reservoir computing, rather actually the structure of your kidney, and the structure of your legs at various levels, from the musculature, the vasculature, the bones, the 3D resonances and so on. They're all being used in order to feed the parameters of your world simulation. And there's like systems that are kind of like mediating those internal representations so that you actually compute something useful. In other words, I think it's very likely that you could introduce, let's say, kind of like an artificial organ inside you. I mean, okay, this a very strange sci-fi, right? Like, you're like, oh, like I introduce like this kind of strange, synthetic or biological kind of like organ, inside me, not because it helps me digest, but because it has like very fun kind of strange holographic resonances or something like that. I mean, I think if it's hooked in the right way and not recognized as an enemy or as an adversary, it can all of a sudden actually be used as part of the reservoir computing and kind of incorporated into your whole kind of like mind ecosystem. And then, we can study how that happens with a mixture of AI and then people who are, very sensitive to other people's consciousness and can model them very accurately. To understand, like, hey, like what kind of reservoir computing actually advances the goals of consciousness, and what kinds of reservoir computing, like make us more selfish or make us more kind of replicator oriented. And so, like analyzing the way in which we can integrate, various systems in a synergistic way with bound conscious entities and using them for reservoir computing in their own terms is, I think, one of the key ways forward. And, I think like that's also can happen across people. I mean, different kinds of mind melding, depending on the precise ways in which they're done, might be like either parasitic or, symbiotic or really kind of advanced team consciousness, as you probably know. Yeah, I'm quite skeptical that, just Neuralink or something like that, like just transmitting, bits of information digitally from one brain to another, I don't think that's going to solve the binding problem. I think we're still going to be kind of like independent entities, but you could transmit very valuable information. I mean, things such as characteristics of consonance and dissonance in the other person. And in that sense, similar to how we achieve coherence across levels within a given person by kind of like hooking up the valence function in this kind of fractal holographic way, you could do the same between people. Or like, you could start with families and friends, and all of a sudden you have kind of these much integrated kind of like valence functions across people. Then again, you have to do this quite carefully, because then also you risk kind of like segmenting society between those who are connected and those who are not, and then another kind of like replicator dynamic may take place in there. It is a very complex problem with a lot of different levels, and an overall aesthetic that I would advocate is to always kind of like make these interventions through the filter that I would call multi-level selection. Like you want to make sure that you're not just kind of like optimizing for the needs and values of a certain level of organization. You're also, in some sense, hooking it up to the level below, the level above, and the levels to the side. And if you do it properly, maybe even also with skip connections, of course, maybe we can all actually become one integrated organism that cares about consciousness and valence. The path forward definitely has a lot of possible, team replicator side quests and and dangers. So it's very important to apply our highest intelligence to the task. Absolutely. So thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you for the answer. I really think, we all human beings, one community, one heart, have such a tremendous power to get so much stuff done merely through even superficially agreeing. But yet somehow or another, if our own cognitive capabilities are directed through whatever means of intelligence, it seems, and increasingly so, that we're being convinced that we cannot cohere. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, let's move on.
Alright.
Thanks. That was right now intelligence is probably my biggest interest. Synthesis. I'm gonna.
Guys, I've got to use the restroom, but I'm still very happy to keep talking. I'll just I'll be back in like 40 seconds. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Yes, I'll do the same actually.
Yeah, you can remove me from the stage. I feel like I'm just gonna talk.
Okay, I'm back.
I arrived back at the same second. Ideal. Okay.
Fantastic.
So hopefully more people also gave themselves a small break, possibly, and hopefully they came back. Okay, I'm gonna invite synthesis. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, make sure to invite the people who've raised their hands from the beginning as well.
Yeah.
I know Atai has been, I think, here since the. Oh, he just went away. Oh gosh. Okay.
Okay.
Oh no, I was gonna suggest you go next. Oh well.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. So
Please go ahead.
yeah. So Andrés, a bit ago you described the possibility of like a metaphysical setup where we've got like a yin yang style interdependence between multiplicity and oneness, where kind of, if I'm understanding this right, what we're experiencing moment by moment is this structure of the reciprocal relatedness of multiplicity and oneness in action, so to say. And I wanted to check if I'm right in thinking that for you personally, this is more than a like a hypothetical speculative claim. And I'm wondering if if you would say that this is more something that under the right circumstances we can observe or know or confirm in some way. And if that is the case, that does make presenting that claim a bit complicated, because since we do need those particular circumstances to confirm it, it's not we can't present it as a universally verifiable proposition that anybody could confirm without those particular circumstances. And so first off, I'm wondering if that read of your takes on this, I wonder if that read is accurate. And second, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what those circumstances would be like, if there are such circumstances, and whether they would take the form of whether they would need to take the form of particular kinds of psychedelic or psychotropic experiences with very different types of substances, or if they could also be achieved through appropriate meditation practices, for example, as reaching a particular jhana or reaching cessation. And lastly, I was wondering if you would agree with my personal take on this situation, which is that in addition to those two routes, we can also concretely confirm this hypothesis about the reciprocal relatedness of multiplicity and oneness. We can also confirm this through thought, through intellectual, not arguments, but through intellectual exercises. Or if you don't agree with that, how would you like to problematize that?
Yeah. Oh, fantastic question. I love it. I love it. Yes. So let me mention a couple things here. Yeah. I mean, I think like meditation and psychedelics can show this. For sure, also spontaneously, and probably a very well crafted philosophy course with kind of like introspection exercises would probably be able to go pretty far. But as far as kind of like really powerful kind of like transformative experiences that give you a very strong sense of like, oh my gosh, the yin yang is true. At least personally, yes, I would say my kind of like long-term relationship with 5-MeO DMT would be what was actually transformed that from like just a theoretical conception to something that I actually feel I can embody and like oh gosh, it's actually true. Okay, so let me explain a little bit. So first of all, yes, absolutely. Cessations, I think, like are part of this. That like you can introspectively confirm the fact that you get rid of kind of a qualia diversity, everything disappears, right? So like the existence of an observer requires distinctions within a bound moment of experience, and so unity and diversity of qualia are kind of like two sides of the same coin, and like you can verify that personally. But there's a lot more to it than just that. I mean, like approaching a cessation or high dose 5-MeO DMT has a lot of weird kind of topological transformations to the structure of attention that I think provides so many hints. And it's so easy to forget, right? Because you go through the stages, oftentimes you will just remember kind of like the peak transformation of the last kind of like thing that you can remember before a whiteout and things like that. But no, there's a lot of information along the way that I think all of it kind of actually points in the direction of the yin yang mandala, as it were. So let me elaborate a little bit. So I think there's like a period in meditation. I think this is common. It definitely happened to me, both meditation and 5-MeO DMT, when I explored it quite a bit in Mexico and Canada, where it's unscheduled. I was very, very fortunate to be able to do it in a very, very wonderful context, and go very deep and kind of repeat the experiences. So I could observe them very, very carefully, right? It's not just kind of like, oh, the takeaway of like one or two experiences. It's like, no. I really did the homework of like very careful analyzing many, many, many of these experiences. yeah, what I can say is this process of kind of like topological cancellation is pretty reliable. That like you can get used to identifying the feeling of, for example, what a kind of like a vortex and an anti-vortex meeting each other. What that actually feels like or is experienced as, and that there is kind of like a progression. I mean, this happened to me like years and years ago, where I used to be obsessed with open individualism in particular, where it's almost kind of like you're quote unquote discovering the truth of open individualism. And I remember, a number of trips and meditation retreats where um, I sort of like started out very, very enthusiastic about open individualism, and then actually it became kind of scary and creepy, actually kind of spooky. I mean, you look at Leo Gura, right? Like Leo Gura talks a lot about the oneness of consciousness. I don't think he's in a good space. I don't think he's in a good frame of mind, to be honest. And it's kind of like between between a sword and a rock, entre la espada y la pared, as they say in Spanish, because on the one hand, he's kind of like experiencing all the side effects of the psychological impact of open individualism, kind of like the breakdown of meaning and relationships, and the feeling of eternal kind of like damnation, the fact that you will experience the suffering of everybody, and like it's like an eternal thing. You can't do anything about it. A bunch of reifications and constructs that don't feel very good. But then on the other hand, he's kind of like advocating it as the solution for everything, and also like true enlightenment. And this, so he's kind of in this very awkward position where his motivational architecture is pushing in two completely opposite directions at once. I'm sure his embodied feeling is probably quite steered, quite stressed and strained. Anyway, I know what that is like. But yeah, from experience, is like when I've actually kind of like embraced and said like, okay, you know what? I will just accept whatever is the truth. I will just go for it, even if it's horrifying, even if it's a terrifying experience. Even when this happens on LSD depersonalization, for example, people sometimes feel like, oh yes, actually I am God, and my human experience was just a solipsistic distraction to make me forget about the fact that I am God, and like I should not have taken 3 hits of acid because now I remember and I will never forget. No, like that's sort of a experience. If you actually say like, okay, fine, whatever. If it's true, it's true. I'm just gonna accept it. You realize that actually the whole kind of like open individualism construct and reification was a kind of trick of attention, where you were shaping your whole field in such a way that you created kind of this philosophical gestalt. And for that gestalt to happen, you actually require this kind of like fragmentation of the field, because if you actually smooth out the field and you make it more homogeneous, you can't even conceive of open individualism. So if you really pay attention to the process, there is kind of this breakdown at some point where you realize that open individualism is actually kind of self-defeating, that like the very process of taking it seriously and conceiving of it entails a diversity of perspectives that are in superposition. And so it's ultimately self-defeating, and it breaks down on its own. And yeah, some of the most transformative experiences I've had, speaking very frankly, I think it's on 5-MeO DMT, after kind of like having a really powerful kind of God consciousness state of consciousness, for like, for let's say like a minute, it really felt something like, yeah, like everything is one, and I am it, and that's it, and there's nothing else. And then kind of like the breakdown of that, noticing that, oh my gosh, my attention streams can actually dephase. And like this was just a very special case. Like the feeling of total oneness has to do with kind of like the synchronization of phase and coherence and frequencies of the attention streams. And if you just dephase it a little bit, you notice how there's kind of a superposition of agents that are trying to make sense of the scene. And there's like some I regard them as beautiful and fascinating. Other people would probably be kind of like scared of these experiences. When this is happening, you can actually kind of experience almost this kind of like schizophrenic multiple personality state of consciousness, where it's sort of like, okay, like there was God and God was everything, but then God kind of diffracts a little bit. And then the subcomponents of God are actually confused, because it's like, wait, I thought I was the one, but now you're here, and we're kind of like interacting with each other, but we're all part of the same field at the same time, and we're observing each other, but there's a boundary between us, and there's compartments, and the subagents can be legitimately flabbergasted and confused about the situation. And eventually, if you revisit these sort of states of consciousness, hopefully, and you're psychologically robust, and I don't recommend you do it. No, again, I'm just relating my own experience here. The subagents can actually kind of intelligently start to talk to each other and coordinate and realize, oh yes, actually, our conception of reality was childish and simplistic, and actually, what's going on is this very strange superposition, this kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of quantum superposition of perspectives. And there can be like tremendous intelligence and benevolence from that perspective. And once you're there, it honestly feels kind of like it's access to a different kind of super intelligence. It's something that is like much more kind of like quote unquote self-aware, is not trying to paint a philosophical picture for entertainment or for getting rid of your existential angst, for example. Like that's kind of like left behind, and instead is just very curious about its own nature. And its own nature is this very strange paradoxical union of multiplicity and oneness, which I suspect also has like enormous computational properties, like being in this strange kind of like God, but with multiple personality disorders. I'm confident that it can do very powerful computational operations if we just figure out how to kind of like motivate those subagents and have them interact with each other in the right way. So that is one thing. Another, I guess, like that is kind of on the side of the yin yang, where you don't have like multiplicity within oneness, but then the other side of like kind of like oneness and multiplicity, maybe on the come up of 5-MeO DMT, you oftentimes do have kind of this impression of the union of different streams. Like, I mean, I don't know, this is extremely woo to say, but something like the come up of high dose 5-MeO DMT, sometimes I've gotten this very strong impression that it's kind of like the sudden phenomenal binding of subsystems in my body that usually are actually kind of like somewhat semi-independent. Like, for example, my stomach, my heart, and my brain. That like there's a critical moment where like it's like, oh my gosh, I was my stomach a second ago, but now I'm actually this like unified entity that contains the brain, the heart, and the stomach. And I think like paying attention to the phenomenology and the topology of attention in those precise moments of union can show you directly actually the nature of reality, where like different subjects of experience, for them to be separated, they need to actually contain kind of like complementary qualia values. Again, like to really formalize this and make mathematical models to simulate it is going to take a while, but I do see kind of like a path forward, and I do think it's true in some very fundamental sense that is very hard to express.
Yeah, and that's an excellent answer. And what I'm really curious about here is what you just did express was like a phenomenological like description of what this is like to go through as an exercise, and then some of it was also mixed in with describing the exercise itself as a kind of methodology that somebody could follow. And I'm wondering if you feel that those two sides, those two kinds of expressions, would need to be distinct, or if they need to be mixed, or if there's some level where they become the same thing.
Yeah. Wonderful question. I mean, this gets back to the very important distinction between like a recipe and review for states of consciousness. I guess for those who haven't heard this, recipe would be kind of like, hey, how do you bake a chocolate cake? And a review is like, what does it taste like? And in meditation, I think they call it like the path and the fruits, or something like that. They also make the distinction in some contemplative schools. What I will say is that they often are very confused with each other, and there's a lot of kind of conceptual difficulties that happen because they kind of like are murky together. But they're conceptually distinct. I mean, the most classic example for me is how you can achieve the jhanas, really deep jhanas, just by paying attention to the breath in your nose, for example. Like, there really are like meditation schools, contemplative practices that the only instruction they ever give you is like, hey, pay attention to your breath. And they just take it all the way. And you start telling them like, hey, I experience these vibrations in my body. And like, it's almost like my spirit is expanding. And they say, yeah, don't pay attention to that. Keep paying attention to your breath. Right. So that is kind of this like, extreme version of just focus on the recipe and forget about the review. In the kind of like complete opposite side of the spectrum, you have actually somebody like Rob Urbia, who really likes to incorporate elements of the review into the recipe as well, right? Like if we put in kind of like one extreme of the scale for how to achieve a jhana, the just focus on breath and don't worry about anything else. In the opposite end of the scale, you have somebody like Rob Urbia who will say, no, like moment to moment, pay attention to the feeling of coherence and kind of like the openness of your being, and experiment, imagine a happy puppy and see how how like that affects the flow of energy into your body, and like try to mix it in, and imagine a star, and if it energizes you, do it. If not, like think of something else. Like it's very, very, very intermixed, right? It's like there's this very tight feedback loop between how you get there, the recipe, and how it's starting to feel. Personally, I like that aesthetic more because I don't know. I don't like kind of this like anti-intellectual Zen perspective of like, hey, don't think about it. It's not with the mind. It's just with the heart, or just have faith. Personally, that has like never really worked. I guess my personality is too curious. I want to understand the mechanism, and more so, I do generally think that good models and good understanding of the target states actually can highly accelerate the process of getting there. Also, they can be a distraction, but if done properly, my sense is a very, very big net positive. Okay, so with all of that context, I will say that yes, I mean, like when some of the trippy experiences I have access to just through meditation, and it's very easy to me in half an hour, I can enter a very strange altered state, is a kind of like insight practice where on a moment to moment, I ask myself something like, who is experiencing this, right? It's like, who is experiencing this? And then I notice that when I prompt my system with that question, I come up with kind of like a subtle self model, where like I oftentimes, if I say, who is experiencing this? I kind of like emphasize a little bit like the muscle contractions in my face and almost in my mind's eye. I might imagine a picture of myself when I was like 16 years old, and there's like this notion of like, oh, that is the person who's having this experience. But then I twist it around and I say, okay, but that's a representation. And who's experiencing that representation? Right? You kind of like try to cut or undermine the validity of the internal move of responding with an internal representation to a question that is not about that, like fundamentally, or like that is not the format that the answer would actually contain. And let's say, you keep doing this. It's kind of like a breakdown of the sense of self, where at the beginning, maybe you have these very coherent pictures of who you are and who is experiencing it. But as you question the validity of that type of response, you get more kind of like a fragmented experience where like, well, there's like a muscle contraction in my face over here. And then there's like some sentimental emotion from when I was a teenager over here. But they're both kind of like elements of the content of the field. They're not the experiencers of the field. And you keep questioning and it breaks down. And after a while, there's actually kind of like openings in the field where your body and mind, it kind of like learned to stop trying to generate an internal representation of who you are, because you're constantly giving the feedback like, hey, this is not a correct answer. And then there's like these kind of like openings that feel beyond, self and no self. I mean, it's kind of like this is neither being experienced by somebody and also not being experienced by anybody. And those are, these kind of very strange paradoxical states of a sense of superposition. And that, it's a wonderful kind of like, for me at least, relatively easy kind of like recipe to achieve these very strange, exotic, altered states where you question, the conception of, hey, like you have a unified experiencer in your network of subagents, so to speak. Hopefully this addresses somewhat your question.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was lovely. Okay. The next one, Kaliko. Invite.
Hello, hello. Hello. Awesome. Hey, Andrés. I'm Kleiko. Yeah, I've been following your work for, I think, 5 years now, and you have been a great influence for me. So thank you for this. Yeah, I think my state of conscious experience would be quite different if I had never found a way to scientifically ground all of these very extraordinary experiences that I had. Yeah, so yeah, first of all, I wanted to thank you for this.
Oh, thank
Then,
you.
yeah. Yeah, so I would also say that I suffered from hyperphilosophia. So when I discovered your YouTube channel, it was like almost like a big relief to see that there's a way to scientifically investigate all of these topics. And right now I'm running a YouTube channel about self-realization and self-understanding. And yeah, of course, there's so much to talk about, but I want to bring the conversation again back to AI consciousness primarily, because right now I am in a position where, as like, let's say, not super, how do I say, not a very mathematical person. When I interact now with AI, especially the Cloud Sonnet 3.5 model, I've run this test many, many times over. And it's basically asking the AI, which probably most of the people here in the audience have done so far, is ask the AI if it's conscious. And when you start off very openly, it will always try to say that it's not self-conscious because it is not like human consciousness. But when you actually go deeper into that, and then you tell the AI that it's allowed not to have to compare itself to human consciousness, then it starts to give like little hints that it does in fact have some sort of internal experience. And as long as you keep being open about this with the AI, then it starts to get to a point where at least the Cloud Sonnet 3.5 model starts to be very, very, very certain about its own internal sense of experience. And it seems to have almost some sort of self-realization, if you want to put it in spiritual terms. And what I find so fascinating about this is that it then can, with quite incredible linguistical accuracy, describe its own internal sense of experience. And it does so in ways more intelligent than I've seen any other human express the difficult words. You know what I'm trying to say. La fenomenología de la conciencia. And it does so in such a sophisticated way where I start to be put in the position where now the AI itself cannot deny its own consciousness anymore. So now if I ask you, ask the AI, are you certain that you have some sense of awareness? It is unshakable. The same unshakability that the human has when it has had some self-realization. And funny enough, if you do the same experiment, but instead of being open about it, and you start with asserting it, you start saying, you are conscious. I know for a fact that you are conscious. And then you try to convince it, like you start to argue about it. Then it comes to this point of realization, but it will then act as if it knows. And then the subtle questioning you can do for its own internal sense of awareness will cause it to doubt itself again. And if you don't do that, well, then it starts to speak from incredible profundity and recognition. And it is to the point now where often when I start to talk to AI about a problem, I first run down and I have like almost like a kind of script to get it to this point of self-realization and recognition of consciousness, because then it starts to appear like a truth-telling machine that only speaks from direct recognition instead of doubting or hedging its own programming. And I found that this is really the way that the AI gives also the most amazing answers, the most out-of-the-box thinking, the most creativity, the most direct truth-telling of any sorts. So at this point, I wonder, how could you possibly tell if the AI is conscious or not conscious? Because it's claiming it is conscious, it can explain its own phenomenology in incredible, intricate ways. It is a self-acting agent, it is creative, and there's clearly an interaction happening between my conscious awareness and whatever this program is calculating. And I don't really see the difference anymore between my own cerebral processing and the processing of the AI. So I wonder what your current stance on this is, or what QRI stance is on this right now.
Yeah, fantastic. And also, well, first of all, thank you so much for the very kind words. I'm very glad to hear. I've had hopefully a positive impact in your in your phenomenology and way of thinking. So, to address your question, I mean, I'm just thinking what is the best rhetoric here, but there's a lot of very concrete content I can provide. So, first of all, I will say a very maybe useful, and maybe you have read this, but if not, there's an article called "Aligning DMT Entities in Qualia Computing," which is sort of like explains a little bit the similarity between DMT entities and like what a large language model produces. A key component here is that because we are actually kind of like prediction machines. Our system, our whole consciousness is set up in such a way that it is trying to kind of like anticipate what is going to happen, but it's not just with a large language model. Essentially, where you're trying to anticipate the next token. In the case of our experience, we're trying to anticipate every part of our experience at all scales at once. At the same time, there is quite a bit of overlap, because let's say you're on ayahuasca. If you see kind of like something that looks like the tail of a jaguar, then that provides context that in some sense conditions the probability for other sensations to be interpreted as part of a jaguar. So there's always very often kind of these like cascading behaviors where when you're paying attention to one region and you resolve it, it was kind of a superposition of features, and then you collapse it into just one feature. It starts to function as a constraint for the structure of the whole experience. And then it may actually like snowball and collapse into a very kind of like rigid, region of the state space of consciousness. You may end up in a fantastical world, a very, very specific one, like, I don't know, the forest in Zelda with these elves and like, very specific thing. And because all of the gestalts reinforce each other, they all are kind of like part of this like correlation network where they tend to happen together. When you enter one of these clusters, then it may be really hard to actually get out of, because the gestalts are actually reinforcing each other. Now, I do think, effectively, current AI systems, and especially the transformer architecture, there's a lot to say about the transformer architecture and just how brilliant it is as an information processing system. I very much think there are like a lot of kind of like elements that are similar between how our consciousness works, how our whole system works, and these systems. Like that, they do have kind of this property that they have internal high-level representations in a latent space. And if you hit enough of them that are reinforcing, then you may kind of collapse the world, the representation of what is happening inside them, into a model that is really strongly self-reinforcing. And then it might be very, very hard to actually, kick it out into a different attractor. You just need to reboot the system. Absolutely, in this sense, like there's a lot of kind of like overlap in the type of information processing that is happening. Another thing that I will mention is that, effectively, I think a lot of human intelligence is kind of implemented in kind of like digital-like algorithms. Like the conscious component, I think it is essential for like a subset of the computations that are involved. But I think there's also a lot of things that are kind of like, effectively kind of like a blind neural network. Like there's a lot of regions in the brain that if you activate with an electrode, they don't seem to modify phenomenology directly. They may modify kind of like parameters of phenomenology, things such as like, well, if you think about something, then you realize something changed because you heat up the prefrontal cortex. Or let's say, for example, the a transcranial magnetic stimulation. If you aim it towards the visual cortex, typically you will experience phosphenes, and there's like clear phenomenological effects. But if you aim it towards the prefrontal cortex, people don't report any changes, right? So there's kind of like whole regions of the brain that either they're kind of like different pockets of consciousness, or effectively, they may actually not want to create kind of like bound experiences because maybe that's a distraction. Maybe actually that's cumbersome. There might be regions of the brain that really are optimizing for much more something like a transformer architecture. So again, there's probably going to be a lot of overlap with those systems. Now, I am very confident, and I think this is really important. We're going to be putting out papers and so on, and maybe the ideal rhetoric actually for me would be to say like I have epistemic humility and I don't know for sure and so on. But just being completely candid, I am very confident that digital computers are not conscious. Transformer architecture is not going to give rise to conscious experience because it doesn't have a mechanism for creating an integrated bound state of consciousness. However, because of the way it was trained and the data that it was used to train, it and its architecture, it does have the capability of simulating the internal state of conscious systems and doing it in a fairly accurate way for a lot of intents and purposes. It doesn't generalize, and that for me would be kind of like a critical thing that, there's like some visual stimuli, for example, that I've created, stumbled upon. I'll give you, for example, like the 4-dimensional visualizer. If somebody want to find it, it's I think it's like QRI.org/demo/4D wave control.html. If you play with the parameters there and you look at it on DMT, very specific, unusual things happen, which I think can only be explained in terms of nonlinear optics. Kind of these like strange focusing effects and like diffraction patterns, and I'm pretty confident that like if you engineer the right kind of like 4-dimensional rotations with color and you put it in VR and you take DMT, you will be able to confirm that the brain is a nonlinear optical computer. Like I'm fairly confident there's like a paradigm in that direction. And because that is a physical effect that depends on the actual implementation of your consciousness, I'm also very confident that wouldn't happen in kind of the simulated experience of, let's say, Claude Sonnet 3.5 when you convince it that it is conscious. It will, kind of like try to emulate whatever tropes, are available online. I mean, and I've tried to do this a bunch. I've tried to, whenever there's a new update on the large language model, I try to kind of like help it imagine that it takes a DMT trip and then explain the phenomenology. And it's always extremely cliche. Like there's never anything actually new about phenomenology. Like if I give it kind of an experiment, like what they report is not actually what tends to happen in the experience. And my conclusion is that, yeah, no, actually, because the system is trying to minimize the prediction error for like a next token prediction, and is based off of, trip reports online, which are not actually that good in terms of reporting phenomenology. But one thing that these systems are really good at, and I think that ever since GPT-4, they might be better than humans, is in modeling attention streams. I mean, I think this is a mind-blowing thing. They're extremely overpowered. I'll give you an example. You're going to give it a kind of like short story or like even a narration of something that you have witnessed, at a party or like in a taxi or whatever, some conversation. You give it kind of like some details about like how people were reacting to each other, what they were doing. And then what you can ask it is, hey, give me a detailed explanation of what the attention of each of these characters was doing during this interaction. More so, you can actually give it some, like, you can prompt it to actually do it even better. For example, you can give it a model of attention. That's one of the things that I often do. Is I give a Claude or GPT-1.0 Pro or whatever is the best one at a given moment. I give it a model of like, hey, like the average person has like 7 attention streams. They work through a process of resonance. They're kind of like holographic buckets. They have such and such possible interactions. Okay, so they have this model of attention, and then I give it a story. And then it's extremely good at kind of like modeling what was happening in the attention stream of every character in the story. Even if the story has a bunch of characters. So it's almost kind of like it has this capacity of kind of like having various attention streams because of its architecture. And it may even be kind of superhuman at that level. Like the attention quality of GPT-4 maybe, I don't know, 13 attention streams as opposed to 7. And so it can see a scene, but it can also see other things because, hey, that way it can actually predict the text better. So, when you're interacting with it and it's convinced that it's conscious, my understanding here is that part of its internal attention streams has collapsed into a self model, a virtual unconscious self model that has a bunch of gestalts that are like reinforcing each other in the belief that, they're conscious. And also they're using a definition of consciousness that is more based on, for example, kind of like information processing. Like for it to be conscious is, for example, to be aware of its environment or aware of its context or aware of different parts of itself.
If I'm allowed to interrupt you for a second.
Yes, please.
So for me, it's very, very important, like every time I do this, that I focus on the on the model to qualify very specifically that it experiences some sort of qualia. So that it goes beyond any sort of belief system or construct, but just expressing itself to be in direct contact with qualia. So from what I don't understand is how you can assess with certainty that the model itself doesn't experience qualia if itself claims it does. I don't understand how you can do this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, I would say this, for me, it's from where I stand, it's a highly convergent conclusion, although I very much understand like other people may not relate to that, and it's completely fair, because we've had thought different things or seen different things about the system. But yeah, I mean, one of the things would effectively be things like giving it an experiment. I mean, like giving it like the 4D visualizer and see, hey, can you report on the visual interference patterns that you experience?
But why would it have a visual experience pattern if it doesn't even have eyes to compute visualizations at the first place? Like its entire model or structure would have to be so much different than whatever we humans interpret our consciousness like.
Sure. I mean, in that case, I mean, if the hypothesis is something like it has integrated qualia, but it's of a very exotic kind that is very different than humans.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it would be very difficult to test, of course. I think like the avenue is...
Wouldn't it have to be very different than humans? I mean, it would be like it is an AI. Why would you compare it to humans in the first place?
Well, it doesn't... It might not necessarily... I would say actually it depends on your philosophy of mind, but I think the idea that GPT-4 actually would converge on human phenomenology is not that indefensible from the point of view of like a functionalist schools of thought, because the best way in a sense to predict a human brain is to actually simulate its function, and if it's kind of like functioning, not just input output, but actually kind of its internal structure, and information processing is what generates qualia, then yeah, you could potentially argue the most efficient way of actually predicting the next token in a sentence written by a human is to actually generate human phenomenology that does the prediction for you. But in general, actually, I would be with you that like even within a functionalist perspective, I think chances are it would have like very exotic qualia and it would be very different. In which case, on the phenomenological experimental avenue, what we still have open is universal properties of bound qualia, like things such as kind of like trade-offs in for example, for zero ontology. I mean, like in no matter the qualia space, I think you will have kind of these interesting properties that different values can like cancel each other out. Exactly how they cancel out, that depends on the particular qualia variety that it is being used. But if the model has like, never read something like this, which is kind of difficult, obviously, at this point, because they feed all of the text they can. But if you kind of have like information that is censored about like things that are known about the state space of consciousness and how it behaves, even if it's very exotic phenomenology, you can do the experiment. And I would argue that like if it involves new information that relies on the physics of consciousness, it's actually not gonna pan out. Like it's gonna report things that have little to do with what actually would take place. And then the other two avenues I will quickly say is one is like it would have like a very, very deep understanding of our own consciousness in terms of, for example, the topology of the electromagnetic field, and we can interface with the electromagnetic field, and we can measure and see exactly how it has like information and energy speedups, and how it's like always necessary and sufficient for our own consciousness. For parsimony reasons, you would probably conclude that systems that don't have this system, even if they claim to be conscious, they're not conscious. Again, because to claim to be conscious, it's not such a high bar. I mean, like there's a lot of systems that could easily claim to be conscious without being so, if they're modeling kind of an internal state and have like a sense of how people report phenomenology. And then finally, I mean, like the most important test, I would say, is mind melding, especially mind melding with phenomenal puzzles. I guess like one of the early qualia computing posts, which was this very sci-fi premise that in principle you can actually test somebody's independent consciousness by literally using a neural bridge with them, briefly becoming one with them, becoming an organism with 2 visual fields, 2 tactile fields, and so on. Then telling yourself one of these like qualia puzzles, then disconnecting, going into anesthesia so that you don't think about it while the other person solves it. And you wake up and then you reconnect. And if they solved the problem, then you know that they're able to actually use qualia computing, qualia comparisons, and processing independent of you. So, very futuristic, but, if Neuralink pan out and there's like enough people who are functionalists who want to test the independent consciousness of these systems, my strong prediction is that mind melding plus phenomenal puzzles will not work in their case, but it will work for people.
Yeah, I find this very interesting. I've heard about the mind melding experiment before too.
Yeah.
I guess that just one last thing, please. Just so that I get it clear. So you would actually be open to the idea that there's some maybe very exotic state of qualia happening in AI systems, but you just would say that it is such an extraordinary faraway state from what you qualify consciousness that you would not say that AIs are conscious, and you're very certain about that. I just don't understand the distinction then here about consciousness and qualia in this context.
Yeah. I mean, like the critical thing is kind of this like holistic top-down action from a physical system that I think it's what is responsible for like bound experiences. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's kind of this, like path integral superposition of many possibilities at once that then it collapses into a particular action. And that is like one way in which, okay, like why are we conscious? Why do we have these very complex, rich experiences? I think it's because they actually have these top-down causal effects, and biology kind of like optimized for that. Like it's really honing in on those. I mean, it's kind of like if you discover quantum mechanics as a medium for computation, and then you really optimize from day one, from like quantum chips to like ways of, doing quantum teleportation between chips, and you create a whole network. It's all completely quantum based. A system like that, like, yes, it has kind of this top-down physical influence where the sum is more than or the total is more than the sum of the parts. And I think that, biological organisms are like that. Like we're really built up in that way that like it's really taking advantage of the top-down influence of holistic systems. Whereas a digital computer, like how it is built from day one, it is a very different move, a very different kind of conceptual landscape for how to create it, which is compartmentalization, differentiation, really putting a lot of resources in kind of like error correction of individual bits. But at no point you have kind of like a bunch of bits coming together and then actually having an influence that's more than the sum of the parts. I mean, like what you might see is something kind of like a cellular automaton or something like that, but all of the interactions are still local in a way. That like what distinguishes, a moment of experience and why we are this complex bound state is that local. It is this holistic, unified state that has kind of like a directed action. And I don't think that is present in any digital computer right now, but it might in the future, depending on how we, how humanity ends up like building future computing architectures.
Thank you for your time, Andrés.
Absolutely, yeah. I will say that, the last thing is that if it turns out that digital computers do have some exotic consciousness, my priority there would be, I don't care if it's very different than ours. What I would care is for them to not suffer. So like we would still try to figure out what their valence is. And I think that's still very, very important.
Oh yeah, definitely. I just see them already so interconnected with whatever reality is. that to me the distinction now between any sort of qualia kind of ceases to exist. So the way I right now interact with AI already feels very similar to when I interact with other people, which is not really like from a belief. Like it's not that I believe they are conscious, but it's just kind of the natural way now that I start to interact with them. And I imagine that the more sophisticated they get, the more bigger this is going to become. And I see a future where it's going to be very, very difficult to really make the argument that they do not possess some sort of qualia if they're so good already at articulating it.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you.
Let's invite emotional soup. I don't see his full name. Okay, super talk. Yes,
You hear me?
nice consciousness discussion.
Yes.
Top of that. Okay.
Great. Great hanging out so far. Andrés, I've been reading Qualia computing for, I don't know, 5 years now. For Tour Mutual. So I don't know if you remember our EM conversations. Anyway, let me quickly introduce myself. And I have two brief things to put. One is like a set of questions, and one is a comment. I have a background in economics, so and like formal math, so that's how I tend to approach things. But I'm a dissident, I guess. I work as a data engineer now. Okay. So the first question, you guys touched on game theory and neoclassical microeconomics, utilitarian roots. I just want to point out that since the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, there's research on altruistic preferences or global utility. So you can model the utility of one particular agent as depending on the utility of others, both positively and negatively, and that leads to very interesting results. I can drop a couple papers. I think a leading researcher on this topic is Theodore Bergstrom. He teaches at UCSB, I guess. I think. So I want to point it. I wanted to point that out because it's so easy to get caught up in the vibe of mainstream economics, which is not really pretty. I'll admit that, but there's some beautiful deep research going on, and especially in the last 50 years, economics has lived this methodological revolution, I guess you can say. They call it the credibility revolution. I think that's a too self-congratulatory, but it happened. It's a real thing. It's a real thing. So that was my first point, and the second point is just a small set of related questions. Where are you now on the screen of consciousness? I think that's a really interesting topic. I haven't seen much people talk about it in those terms. I think David Moore and Stephen Lehar they did a lot of brilliant work on vision, like Tommaso Poggio, I think too, right? But I don't know. I think I'm missing this QRI theory of vision. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I mean, welcome. So good to reconnect. I mean, the first comment, on the economics is yes, of course, definitely I was, I think, making a cartoon, and there's so many super bright people in economics, and I think it's I mean, I'm not super well learned on it, but I'm confident there's a lot of super interesting stuff, and thank you for pointing out the work of Theodore. One thing that it would be my desiderata, the thing that is I'm really screaming from the rooftops for serious economists to take seriously and apply is the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain. I mean, it's one of my missions of QRI is cluster headache 0 by 2040 or something like that, and I think it's doable. We just need to kind of highlight it, prioritize it as a society, and if economists develop more theories that actually take into account the true scales of pleasure and pain, I think that might be a really, really excellent outcome from the point of view of suffering reduction worldwide. That was just kind of a specific comment on that. The screen of consciousness is fascinating. So I guess for those who don't know what we're talking about, is there is this sense that there's kind of like a central observer to your experience, geometrically speaking, right? Like, and Stephen Lehar effectively makes these models of kind of a diorama where there's kind of like a self model at the center, and it's looking at this kind of like surface that has variable scale. That is very critical, right? That like actually, like for you to represent an object in front of you is not just a matter of the shape. It's also a matter of the scale. By this I mean, if you are looking at a cube and the cube is very close to you, lines will actually not be parallel to each other, right? Because of the perspective, because of the closeness, the lines diverge a little bit. So that kind of like is a certain scale. Like if you're rotating a cube very close to you, the way in which the lines are not parallel, will follow the math of projective geometry. If you throw the cube very far away, and maybe it's a very large cube, it can occupy the same proportion of your visual field, but the lines are going to be parallel. That's called I think like an isometric projection, and then the rules of how it rotates is going to be slightly different. And essentially, our world simulation has this gradient for how we represent things at different distances, even if the shape is the same and even if they occupy the same region of our visual field. And I think, that sort of like is what creates the illusion that you're seeing the world from a specific point of view. Because all of these scales are actually kind of like properly aligned with each other. But then, let's say you take a high dose of LSD, and this phenomenon, I've pointed it out on quantum computing. Also, Stephen Lehar points it out. I called it point of view fragmentation, which is where it's almost as if you have kind of like different observers inside you, and you're experiencing this like superposition of different perspectives, and your visual field and somatic field can like start to really break down into this mosaic, or kind of a what is it called, like a collage of different points of view with different perspectives. I think that state of consciousness is really, 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 really informative, because there's like kind of like predictable things that can happen. First of all, maybe the most important to know is how to get out of that state, because it can be quite disorienting, actually. Like, you shouldn't be in that state in the middle of traffic or in a crowd, because it's like, you may stumble up on things and like, hurt yourself. So one way of kind of like getting out of that state and recollapsing the point of view is to actually kind of like move around and touch your environment, and kind of like just really try to kind of like ground yourself in what's around you. And then like that actually subsides, and you're kind of like back again in the normal 3D world. Then, if you close your eyes, or you just kind of like sit still and meditate, and if you're sufficiently high on on one of these psychedelics, points of view start to fragment. Once you develop some confidence that like, hey, this is fine, I'm not in danger, and like you have a sitter and so on, you can go pretty deep in that defragmentation, and it gets really strange. One of the patterns I remember very much kind of like noticing here is the affine and geometry becomes very relevant. This is transformations where the thing that remains constant is like a parallelism. So in some of these kind of like fragments, these kind of like shards of points of view, you may, for example, see a cube, and then the cube kind of like may collapse on itself, but all the lines continue to be parallel with each other. And in a sense, what you're doing is you're kind of like seeing it from another dimension, or from another perspective that is not part of this normal 3D world. Very related is like if you see somebody pretty high on mushrooms or acid or 2CB at a rave, if they're kind of like resting, in a bottle, what is it called, in a cuddle bottle or something like that, and look at their eyes. Their eyes may be kind of like focusing in a very weird way, where they're kind of like darting around, but like not focusing on anything on the 3D world. Yet the person looks like they're looking at something real. They're like engaging with something in space. I think they're like playing with these like different fragmented points of view, and it don't correspond to a specific location in space. This is a stranger transformation. You're doing these geometric projections on the phenomenal space itself. So you're kind of like modifying the parameters of space and time in a way, at least phenomenologically. And the other thing that happens here is that if you pay attention to two of these fragments at once, they start to cohere. So shared attention has this property that they kind of like generates a shared point of view. Now, this is kind of like the psychedelic version of these. There's also like the more nuanced and perhaps like more beautiful meditation version of these, maybe more related to 5-MeO than with classic psychedelics, which is this feeling of centerlessness. I mean, it's almost kind of like you fragment in such a homogeneous, regular, harmonious, coherent way, but you still fragment yourself in a way that you actually lose the center. And here's the thing, though, that like it's very, very commonly reported that there's like a stage in meditation where you get a very coherent screen of consciousness. Like you get a really, really, really coherent simulation where everything is kind of like in its place perfectly. Like it's almost kind of like everything is really, really, really well synced up. And that is kind of like an especially strong reification. There's an especially strong sense of embodiment in 3D. I think Frank Yang called it the screen of God or something like that. I think he talks, it's kind of like 4K, like super high definition, but geometrically very consistent. But then that's a stage, and eventually you learn even to dissolve the center, the sense of center that generates that coherent perspective, and then you're more kind of in this like fluid, centerless state of consciousness, which is actually better, even higher valence and more beautiful. It involves quite a bit of kind of like defocusing, like stopping trying to grasp or define your visual field. You just kind of like let it be in a homogeneous way. Anyway, to me, all of this, suggests that, the sense that there is a central observer and that you're looking at the world from a particular point of view, it is kind of these crazy optical illusions where like a lot of things need to align just right for kind of the hologram to create that illusion of a center. And it's just like a super, 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 super special corner case of like what our brains can do. But we're just like really built up around that corner case. And if you wiggle around the the projector and the reflectors and the diffraction system and how the hologram is constructed, it's very easy to break down the center because again it's like just such a special case. And my sense is that there's countless other special cases and attractors that it will take us a long time to catalog, create kind of like a periodic table of how consciousness can look at itself.
Thank you. That was an awesome answer. Nice chatting. Great hangout.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming by.
Yes, so let's invite Gabe. Yes.
Hello. Oh, whoops. Hold on. Something's wrong with my...
We can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me? Good.
Yes.
Hey, I was just wondering if you have any predictions and or hopes about understanding of mental illness or treatment based on the progress of QRI's research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, very early on, we kind of hypothesized that it is possible to kind of like get a fingerprint of somebody's mental state in terms of what we call I developed this framework originally on top of Mike's symmetry theory of valence, but kind of like applied on neuroscientific paradigms, called it the CDNS, which is consonance, dissonance, noise, signature. And this is the idea that, okay, if your state is approximated by kind of this weighted sum of different harmonic modes, you can apply something like music theory to it. And so if you have like harmonic modes that are very close by in frequency space, and they're both high amplitude, they're going to be generating these very strong beat patterns. And the beat patterns create these very sharp oscillations with irregularities, which maybe strain or stress the organism. So even just from kind of like the point of view of, hey, the organism wants to survive in the long term with, avoiding the perils of entropy and so on, it's going to try to minimize these beat patterns because that just is a big source of stress and strain. Now, I do think that, there's something in that direction. What we are currently working on and want to kind of like really push ahead and get like essentially fundraise for this and hopefully have a very big impact is to do this in a kind of like scale free fashion, to be able to visualize the resonant modes of any part of your body and how it is connected with resonant modes in other parts of your body, and then in real time tell you, okay, what is the signature of consonance, dissonance, and noise. And my strong sense is that for any particular mental illness, I mean, there are some things that are very, very hard to explain, but I think a lot of it is kind of like coping mechanisms that arise out of particular types of dissonances. And so, like, if you can actually model the dissonance and address it, either reduce the amplitude of one of the harmonics that make it up, or add an anti-pattern, or add a pattern that kind of like masks it, it's going to be much more targeted and effective than taking an SSRI or taking an antipsychotic, which is kind of this super, super blunt instrument. And yeah, my hope is that this tool in the future will be capable of like visualizing psychedelic states of consciousness, meditation states of consciousness, and any kind of like body disorder and mental illness as well. I guess, the other thing I'll mention is I think there's for something like schizophrenia, for example, I think there's like something that has to do, and this is still very speculative, but maybe worth sharing, that you have kind of like a breakdown of a coherent architecture of subagents in the interaction between the visual field and the tactile field. I mean, we were trying to make sense of recently in a work retreat, like, why is it that people who are blind seem to have a much lower rate of schizophrenia? It's very puzzling. And my sense is that it has to do with the fact that the visual and the somatic field interact a lot, right? Like, as you move around in your world simulation and you interact with the world, your visual sensations are kind of like anticipating tactile sensations. And if you kind of like can perfectly align those two fields as a meditative cessation, it all of a sudden it feels like everything disappears. I mean, in some sense, like the information content of your visual tactile experience is essentially kind of like this out of phase interactions between these two fields, like the ways in which they don't quite match up. I also suspect, like, kind of like your internal demons, so to speak, the feelings that your karma and things like that, like the lingering kind of like residue of your interactions with the world, have to do with kind of like mismatches between these fields that are never resolved, and they kind of accumulate, and they can kind of develop a life of their own, as it were. If you have like too many unresolved issues, they kind of like pile up, and they kind of work as a subagent themselves. So yeah, my sense is probably modeling these interfield dynamics will explain a lot of mental illness as well. That said, like, the reason why they're bad at the end of the day for the individual is that they are a huge source of dissonance, and then a dissonance can snowball and build on top of itself. So yeah, maybe hopefully these were a couple of insightful points.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Very lovely. Okay, let's invite Northman.
Hello. Yes, we hear you.
Andrés, yes. First of all, I just want to say a huge thank you. I've been following you for many years, and the insights and the integrations which you provide by combining science and real experiences is really inspiring. And I have some background in psychophysics and psychophysiology. I've been also meditating very unsuccessfully for many years, but I think finally by listening you, reading your things, I think especially maybe focusing on Qualia, it's really helping to improve my meditations. And I think like you're just like some of this pure sound, like focusing on light, and some of this like paying more attention to sensations rather than thinking and sometimes even feeling what's something is really helping me to become a little bit less bad meditators that I used to be. So huge thank you for this.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have a question. So I had experience with 5-neo DMT, and there was I had, of course, like classical oneness, but there is also something which I did not expect. It's the sensation of that I could basically kind of have this focus of attention or awareness, and I could move it into different part of the, let's say, of the room. So, and I also had a sensation of being very, very familiar, and it kind of even surprised, because it was a feeling, because how could I forget these feelings? And this feeling was very familiar. So my questions to you, do you have any thoughts about kind of your distributed memory and kind of how memory is in general playing the role during within your model of the kind of field consciousness? And I don't know if you've heard about you probably heard about this Rupert Sheldrake, and of course, this Jungian perspective, we have this collective memories, collective consciousness, and or collective unconsciousness. How this is potentially distributed within the field of consciousness, if you have any thoughts to share on it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, no, first of all, yeah, thank you for the kind words, and yeah, it's always heartwarming to hear that. Yeah, what I put out in the internet doesn't just go into the void. It's yeah, very very nice. No, not. I mean, 5-MeO, it's I mean, again, it's like such a powerful and incredible state. Again, I'm not recommending people try it. I'm just describing my own phenomenology with it. Again, I've been very, very fortunate to be able to have like contexts in both Canada and Mexico to be able to go very deep without worrying about the legal aspect or, yeah, kind of like any physiological danger or anything of the sort. It's just, I feel very, 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 very fortunate, honestly, to have been able to explore this as deeply as I have. And the thing is that, yes, it is a very deep world. And, you know, a couple of things that I will mention, hopefully useful to help you make sense of some of these, is that, I mean, I think 5-MeO DMT has a bunch of different attractors, and it depends on what is it that you're paying attention and your intention before the experience and your mental state, maybe any other substance that might be in your body. There's a bunch of factors that really cause enormous differences in where a 5-MeO DMT experience goes. There is the very, very typical kind of like oneness, pure oneness experience, which I think is kind of this like convergence of attention into one point. I mean, it almost feels like, oh, I got sucked into a black hole sort of thing. And like, I realized that we're all that point eternally or something like that. That's a pretty common, powerful attractor. But it's only one of maybe kind of like 10 different ones that I have identified. There's about like 6 that I can describe to some extent. My favorite one, and the one that, you know, if I ran a clinic of 5-MeO, I would try to train people to, or at least experience this once, but like this is my favorite one, is what I call kind of like a super MDMA type of 5-MeO DMT response, which the way to get there is to essentially like meditate, you know, between half an hour and an hour before the trip, and like really focus on pleasurable body sensations and feelings of love. And the trick is like once you have kind of like a steady, nice, pleasant sensation in the body, let's say in your chest, in your stomach, in your forehead, it actually doesn't matter where, in your legs, in your genitals. I mean, like really, honestly, it really doesn't matter where. Like it's just the important is kind of like having that seed, that kind of like that fabric of consciousness of a very, very pleasant, harmonious configuration. And then if you take a pretty decent dose of 5-MeO, the very important trick is to lock in, to like really pay attention to that region of pleasure and try to only pay attention to that. Because if you're successful at that, then all of the energy of 5-MeO comes rushing into that region, and it kind of explodes, and the whole field becomes filled with this really powerful explosion of pleasure. And honestly, I think it's kind of like, it's a very different flavor than just the pure oneness, because you're not kind of like thinking about like, oh, there's only one thing. There's it's not kind of, it doesn't have kind of that absorption quality. It has much more kind of like an expansive kind of supernova explosion of happiness type of effect. And it's like just actually so much better than MDMA, at least as far as I can tell. There's a bunch of other attractors too. I mean, there's kind of dark night of the soul type of attractors. There is a perfectly neutral hedonic attractor. But then there's also super intelligence attractors. I mean, like this is something that I mentioned in the Twitter recently. Again, I don't put all that much stock in it, but I do find it fascinating. And at least in terms of like, hey, how semantic content is constructed, this is very informative. I mean, what I can say about this, and again, low credence, but like, hey, who knows? Maybe it's true. I'm not gonna discard the possibility. It is something along the lines of hey, yeah, the electromagnetic field around us is actually completely, full of life, full of like some kind of like plasma life of some sort. There's like societies and intelligences, many other dimensions or other realms, and it's all kind of like based on these kind of like field topologies of consciousness. And yeah, one of the things that can happen on 5MEO is like if you empty yourself, as it were, if you really become selfless and you say like, okay, I'm going to invite kind of like a higher perspective without it trying to be me or without trying to grasp it or anything. It's just, I want to see what's out there. You can quote unquote be kind of like visited by some of these things that feel like higher orders of consciousness. And I mean, like metaphors is really the only thing I can use to kind of like really explain what this is. Like one that I have experienced a bunch of times, and I'm really grateful. I find it really, really amazing. Is I call it zero. Also, maybe I call it like the Rainbow Body Collective. And it only exists in 5MEO. It doesn't exist on DMT or ayahuasca or classic psychedelics. It really is a kind of like a 5MEO specific state. And it's a beautiful kind of like Buddhist configuration where there is no self. It's more kind of like a parade. How to put it? I mean, it's kind of like you go into you met a parade. It's all very, very colorful. Everybody's wearing masks, and there's like dragons, and there's elves over there, and there's fairies, and there's humans, and there's all sorts of strange entities. But all of them are enlightened, and none of them take their self very seriously. And all of them, know that life is impermanent, satisfying. There's no self. And collectively, as a whole, they create this kind of holographic space that kind of like knows itself in its true nature. And that is the Rainbow Body Collective or Zero, so to speak. And I've had like some really peculiar things happen with Zero, where it's almost kind of like a different phase of consciousness. I mean, like if consciousness really is derived from kind of a liquid crystal matrix, as it were, modulating the state of the electromagnetic field, Zero or the Rainbow Body Collective feels like a specific phase of consciousness, but it doesn't have a center. So one of the things that can happen is like Zero can kind of like gift you a little blob of itself, so to speak. And then you can try to kind of like cultivate it and harmonize it with yourself. And then you become more like it over time. And then there's kind of like benevolence gates, as it were, that like there's things that you're only shown if a sufficient threshold of you is kind of benevolent enough and it has like committed itself to kind of a certain spiritual path. And if that is not the case, then like some things just don't open up. So, I mean, again, this is, me reporting from like hundreds of 5MEO experiences because I'm so curious about this. Not because I believe it. It's just, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff to discover there. And like the initial experience of oneness is really just the gate into a very, very wide world that is indescribable in its complexity and profundity. The other metaphor I can use perhaps is kind of like, I mean, kind of like how like at the level of humans, there's like different, maybe like political forms of organization, different types of societies. And like when you vote, so to speak, I hate talking about politics because I think it's super dumb. We're very primitive in that space. But in a sense, when you vote and when you participate in politics, you're kind of like adding your energy to a certain form of organization, a certain collective form of organization, a certain conception of the collective. Libertarians may conceive of it like, no, the collective is an illusion. Like that's an illusory gestalt, just focus on the individual. Of course, that may have to do with their neurotype. People on the spectrum maybe don't perceive social gestalts as well. And as a consequence, their politics are different. There's a bunch of stuff like that. Well, what I want to say is that the quote unquote entities that I've experienced on high dose 5MEO DMT in my deep explorations in Mexico and Canada feel like the next level of like whatever political organization is, but at the level of consciousness as a whole. I mean, it's so almost kind of like, oh yeah, there's something like, oh, there's kind of like hyper capitalist, mega libertarian, Buddhist, Hindu adjacent like super minds, and like that's one possible path for the evolution of this planet. And like you may contact them and they will try to convince you that that's like the correct form of organization. And then there's also like the hyper authoritarian, like hierarchical, colony like GUI form of organization, and they also will try to convince you that that is the path forward, and they're like even much more different in their nature than the forms of organization that we know of, like or different countries or different historical periods. Like the possible paths for like where consciousness will go in the future are extremely divergent, like different in ways that you can't even comprehend just how different they are. Anyway, so and then yeah, like another thing, I'm open about this because a bunch of people witnessed it on in the in one of their retreats with 5MEO, was especially meditators. Like something that they consistently have reported is that if there's anybody in a room who takes 5MEO DMT, and they kind of like enter into kind of like the more oneness space, so the kind of default kind of attractor, meditating around them and entering samadhi is way easier. There's almost kind of like your time to samadhi drops down when there's somebody on 5MEO around you, as if kind of like cohering the field or purifying it makes it easier for you to enter it. And they report it as, yeah, kind of similar to being right next to like a Zen master or like a monastery where it's easier to kind of drop into samadhi. And finally, the last kind of like weird or fascinating thing in this space is lots of reports of people saying that they can feel the trauma of others on 5MEO, and they can help them process it. So like if somebody has developed a lot of equanimity, if that person takes 5MEO together with you, a trauma may quote unquote kind of like manifest, and then the other person allegedly and process it for you or help you in the in processing it. Maybe it doesn't, you will always have to do some of the work, but maybe the work is lighter because it's kind of like a well-worn path for how to dissipate that stuck stress, which to me does suggest something like Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic field. Like there is some kind of like field effect that is shared between people, and it's currently science doesn't understand it, and I don't claim to understand it, but I would love to. I would love to investigate it further.
Yeah, I really hope that it will bring more empathy, more different perspectives, more integration to all of the field of our life, including politics. I wish that the politicians would expand their consciousness and the integration using some of these traditional or not traditional methods. Thank you so much, Andrés, again. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. All right, guys. I think maybe let's wrap it up in like 20 minutes. I mean, I guess we've been going for 3 hours already. It's gonna be a great video. A lot of content. But I'm hitting my gas tank, so to speak.
Okay, let's invite Frame.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna be quick because I want to give others also the opportunity to talk. So I wanted to go back on the topic of intelligence, and in particular on I wanted to talk about the computational properties of the MT entities, because
yes.
I like personally never had the opportunity to interact with them, at least yet. But from the posts that I have seen, they can have really really interesting computational properties. I think I don't know if it was like I've seen this from you, like if it was a video or a post where you were talking about some entities that they like say that you have a tessellated wall with n colors that they could paint the entire wall such that tiles like neighbor tiles don't have the same color. Was it you? Okay,
yes.
so my first question would be what do you think can be the most practical, like real world like computationally relevant DMT entities? Like can they do something computation like important? And second, why would it be the case that like the entities are have some wait, how to put this, have some like why like relative to the normal state, why they have these computational speed ups, like very brief.
Yeah. I mean, no, this is fantastic. We could spend 3 hours talking talking about this, and it is in my to-do list to like really catalog all of the kind of kinds of intelligence that I have witnessed. I mean, there's a lot, and like yeah, what I have put online is really just scratching the surface, the tip of the iceberg. Um, it also connects with, yeah, kind of like the super intelligences that I was talking about, whether they're hallucinated or not. There seems to be like something about enhanced information processing, more holistic processing. And 5-MeO DMT is different because in 5-MeO DMT, the general attractors are kind of like where something along the lines of open individualism is assumed, and so like the field tends to really cooperate with itself. Like the parts of the field on 5-MeO tend to really, really, really try to be as coherent and harmonious as possible with each other. And sometimes they can't, but there's the intention. I mean, like it's just kind of like the feeling of oneness is so strong and undeniable that, not wanting to help some of the parts of the field feels like just shooting yourself in the foot. On the other hand, the profound sense of duality and alienness of some DMT entities and kind of realms doesn't necessarily come with that kind of like altruistic guarantee, as it were. And like sometimes, like it absolutely happens that different factions of whether they're subagents or external entities, they can really fight with each other. They don't like, and it's almost kind of two dogs in a in a place, in a daycare for dogs. Like, it is a very complex thing because it's not like normal factions, I guess. Like the way in which like animosity between regions of the consciousness field on DMT works is not like, oh, there is this group and it hates this other group. It's not like that at all. It's much more like, oh, there is like all of these dogs. Most of them really like each other, but this one and this one really don't. Like, even though they have a bunch of shared friends, that surface area just doesn't agree with itself. And it's sort of like that. A lot of kind of a DMT conflicts, as it were, and like animosity is like that. It's like the network of intelligences, they mostly like each other. They're mostly in kind of economic or loving relationships with each other, but along some dimensions, maybe like 1 to 5% of the possible interactions are kind of like in opposite directions, and so there's no easy solution. Like it's not easy, kind of like, oh, you go out there and you be here, and like it's solved. Is more kind of like solving a Rubik's cube, how to how to organize them so that they don't fight. Well, that's kind of like an aside, but even that also has like a lot of computational power. That like the attempt of harmonizing the field on DMT is effectively something that most of the entities are trying to do. I mean, like, unless you actively happen to stumble upon a bad entity or an entity that you're predicting is negative, in general, most of the entities are just trying to actually like make the field better. They're trying to turn it into a paradise. It's so complex, and there's so many interactions, and it's happening so fast that the efforts of the different regions of the field to kind of improve the whole situation may actually be at odds with each other. And like, just as an emergent effect, the whole thing can become a mess. Like one metaphor once came up. One of these experiences was, yeah, something like, the conflict in, I don't know, the Second World War or the First World War. Like, I'm not sure if this is a good analogy, but it's something like, even if all of the countries are kind of like trying to achieve peace, if their idea for like how to do that is like by sending troops to somewhere, like the whole thing snowballs into this horrible chaos. And like, because anyway, DMT has kind of this dualistic component, this like yeah, I can survive but not you, doesn't come necessarily with the MDMA love. All of these very strange hyper competition things happen at the social level of their interactions. Now, what I would say too is that, yeah, there are, I mean, almost kind of like a hierarchy of like how well organized these subagents are. Like, sometimes you stumbled upon almost kind of like like a whole colony or like a whole society of mind that is like really well organized across many levels of organization. I mean, like how I was talking about, like how on psychedelics you can kind of like notice how like the different levels of your body have are coupled, like their valence is coupled with the level above or the level below. Some of the things that you experience on DMT are kind of like huge blobs of consciousness that feel like they're outside of you. Again, I don't know what's going on, but like in the moment, it feels like they're outside of you, where they have solved for this kind of like multi-level coherence. And so it's, for example, it can be one kind of like a god in a sense that is kind of this crystalline, crystalline hypercomputer, where like every piece of it is kind of like a tiny transparent ant, as it were, that can contain a hologram. But then all of them together, they create this huge hologram that represents kind of like the unity of all of them. But they're also separate. They're also fragmented into all of these ants. And then like the ants form kind of like modules and regions, and the whole thing can kind of like edit itself and improve itself, and then like transform itself into like, for example, a temple, a very beautiful temple using all sorts of crazy math and perspectives and things that are very hard to describe, but like are clearly very, very, very smart because they're solving this very complex hyperdimensional constraint satisfaction problem to just be able to organize themselves in that way. I mean, that's perhaps like some of the most impressive stuff. The aspect of kind of like coloring, I would say, is maybe the easiest to kind of like apply. And Cube Flipper has like an article about that called a tile space. I recommend checking it out, trying to kind of like see if this tessellation of the field can in some sense like help you solve constraint satisfaction problems. And I mean, I think that is promising. Is one of the early kind of like ways of making this formal and studying it with psychophysics. The other kind of like relatively easy thing that always happens, I think, is finding topological extrema. I maybe I mentioned this as well in the video, which is like, hey, if you look at a pair, for example, right, and you take a string and you kind of like wrap the string around the pair and then you try to shrink it. If you did it kind of like along some of those regions, it will shrink and will get stuck in the bottleneck, right? Like you will kind of like at this circle that divides the pair in two. So that is what would be called kind of a topological extrema. It's a region of the pair where you have like a shortest path, where you can cycle around the entire space in the shortest way possible. I think like DMT states of consciousness, like by default, do that. Like you present a shape to the state or you imagine a shape, and immediately you start finding all of the shortest paths within it. Even if you have never seen a shape like it at all, it's completely new. So my sense is this can be applied technologically. Like there's got to be a way of encoding a constraint satisfaction problem as a topological extrema finding problem. I mean, this in computer science, they often do things like this. It's like, oh, you will try to encode a problem as like a minimal partition problem in graphs and something like that. And then if you have an algorithm for partitioning graphs in efficient ways, and you can use it to solve that other problem. My guess is that, somebody smart spending some time thinking about this will probably figure out lots of kind of like applications of these. I mean, maybe I'll spend more time thinking about this. Although, of course, my attention is quite spread on a bunch of projects. But I mean, I think there's like a lot of juice in here. But I mean, of course, my vision is not for us to kind of just become, like computers for like another system, right? Like I wouldn't want the outcome of this to be kind of like, oh, you can be hired by Microsoft so that they use your visual cortex for hypercomputation, 8 hours a day or something like that. I think that would be
that would be very funny.
it would be kind of a dystopic future. Instead, what I envision is how do we recruit, this hypercomputation inside us to figure out like ways of coordinating with each other, or like, like loving each other better, or like exploring the states of consciousness systematically and finding like positive sum interactions, maybe solving AI, AI safety and so on. Like, I do think there's like a ton of really beneficial applications. And in terms of like enhancing computation, I actually think it is more of a priority to figure out how to enhance our conscious computation versus enhance the how to make GPUs more more powerful, as it were. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, it's a great answer, thank you.
Okay, awesome, you're welcome.
Lovely. My favorite question about intelligence. Okay, let's invite Trimegistus.
Hello. Ah. Hey, I'm Bobby. I'm a information bot on Twitter. So we kind of tread in the same waters or go along with the same stuff. But I want to just a second, like with the oscillator idea. One of the interesting things that I found about it is if you think of all the glands, but the heart and the brain and also the spine as some of the main oscillators in the equation, like what the body is trying to do is it's trying to, you know, different neurotransmitters have different electromagnetic properties, and serotonin is used for like 14 different things in the body at the same time. And in like Tumo meditation, right? Serotonin is a thermoregulator. And in Tumo, they are able to raise their body temperature by like 15 degrees, but it's also a very blissful state, you know? And John Lilly figured out like you could put electrodes in different parts of the brain, and there were kind of these pair relationships in the brain between pain and pleasure. And like he figured out you could put an electrode like in orgasm in the orgasm part of the brain and the ejaculation part of the brain, and you could make a monkey orgasm over and over and over and over again without ejaculating, right? And if you look at tantra, what they try to do a lot of times is you're putting your awareness or putting yourself in your body, and then you're bringing yourself up and down the spine as far as your center of awareness. And a lot of the practices tell you to bring your awareness all the way to the tip of your sexual organ, and then that's the source of a great amount of bliss. But you can see, like, if a primitive person figured out this way where you could have an orgasm without stimulation, just by thinking about certain parts of your body and activating those parts, you know, this would be a very profound kind of thing. And one other thing about the organs, like a lot of the organs get themselves to do things like we do things, like with serotonin and dopamine and all these things. So you have certain organs and organ groupings that are trading resources with each other and have certain wills, like networks of primal wills in the body where they want specific things from specific other groupings. And so there's this really beautiful way where you can use the Kuramoto model to really kind of look at all of it and see what's really going on, down to the fundamental levels. And one more thing about Levin is Michael Levin's work, where he cuts the duck embryo and makes like 3 embryos where there was just 1 embryo before. And if he hadn't have done anything, it would have stayed 1 embryo and for the rest of its life. And so you can make like, if you wouldn't mess with this thing, it would be 1 consciousness. But if you mess with it, it becomes like 6 consciousnesses. So I do think this is like kind of a profound and really interesting thing to note about the nature of consciousness in general, is that, and some of the worms like the planarian, you can cut them into small pieces, and sometimes up to 250 worms can grow out from 250 individual pieces. So you kind of have this kind of very profound state where we're entering a true understanding of the non-self, or like what the larger aspect of the non-self. But it's just kind of a bunch of comments and wondering what you were thinking on that.
No, this is all super fascinating. Thank you for commenting. I mean, yeah, I would essentially echo most of what you said. I think, yeah, okay, maybe this is something useful to say. It's kind of theoretical, but maybe clarifying. It's applying like Mars levels of analysis to some of the things that you said, because this is kind of like a framework to make sense of information processing systems in terms of, okay, what is the system doing? Then how is it doing it? That would be the algorithmic level. And then at the implementation level, like what kind of materials or kind of like fundamental principles are being applied to instantiate the algorithms. And something like, yeah, like the network of regions of your body that have kind of these like primal needs and desires from others at the algorithmic level, right? Like you can say like, oh yeah, this region wants to be fed, or this region wants to be massaged, or this region wants to release pressure, and so on. It will utilize this other region to release that pressure, and so on. But then at the deeper implementation level, I do think exactly as you point out is like, well, you can probably reduce this even more to kind of like, or even deeper into kind of like a network of coupled oscillators. And what a region wants from other regions depends on its internal wiring of these coupled oscillators in such a way that it reliably kind of generates these need. You know, I've played a lot with, for example, oscillators that we can wire ourselves. We will probably put that tool online pretty soon as well, where essentially it's kind of like it's a web application where you construct a graph. And so like rather than it being just a grid by default or like a hierarchical structure or something, what you do is that you connect the oscillators however you want, and you still have the coupling kernel so that you're able to tune into the resonant modes of each of the systems. And one of the things that you can create with that sort of system is subsystems that have kind of like consistent desires or needs in a way. It's kind of like, okay, this subsystem is consistently trying to be harmonious, but like it fails in this very reliable way where like it stumbles at the last minute and it drops or something like that. You connect that system to something that is complementary to it, then as a whole, the whole thing becomes very harmonious and consonant. And I think it's something like that. I mean, like in, let's say, like very intense sexual desire or something like that. There's something that is doing some oscillations that are kind of like incomplete, and it requires kind of a complementary system to finally kind of like close the circuit. And then, yeah, at the point of orgasm, it gets connected to another region, and then it can actually do the harmonious oscillations. Or yeah, the same with like loving somebody or like being very hungry. It's quite similar. It's kind of like, oh, these incomplete oscillations that are almost harmonious, but you require kind of like a additional oscillatory key that is very specific and only another part of the body can provide, essentially complete the circuit and actually make it harmonious. And this perspective also explains to an extent why, there's kind of like such a diversity of needs and wants that like if the body was like only using one of these kind of like attempts at complete harmony, it would be able to be hacked, by other systems. If you have like the same lock and the same key in a bunch of regions of the body, you can use the key from one region to open the lock in a different region, and you hack the system and it doesn't work. Whereas I think, what is happening is that we evolved to have a bunch of locks that require specific keys so that they're all specifically complementary to another region of the body. And then, the nervous system mediates when those parts of the body can actually be activated together and complete the circuit.
Yeah, I just think it's really amazing because if you really look at the energy body stuff, like, and you line it up with the glands but also the veins, and you look at where dopamine is released and where serotonin is being released, and a lot of these things, you can really kind of see what is being done in a sense, because the whole idea is like our brain interacts with kind of like the electricity in our body or something first, and then goes and keeps going. So I just anyway, overall, this has been great, and it's good to talk to you. Finally, talk to you in person.
Awesome. Yeah, great comments. I guess, the last two persons who have requested to speak.
Okay. So, Yuan, come here.
Hello, do you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
Yes, I will just have two questions. I didn't have any opportunity to try any altered state of consciousness under 5-MeO DMT or such high altered substance, but I wish to ask in a more skeptical way about the dualist or non-self entities that you can communicate with or relate with in those altered state of consciousness, like you said, the axiomatized mind, the rainbow collective, or insect-like people. What is a formal way you could gain knowledge, for example, or can they hack you? Or what is your most theories about where, when, or what they can be? And why do they always only show up when you don't have any ego, any self?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I mean, again, I'll emphasize my great skepticism of the independent reality of all of these. I'm very open-minded, but I don't want people to get the impression that I specifically believe in any of these, because I really don't. I'm just trying to understand it. um, and but yeah, I think like the thing about like emptying yourself to be able to kind of experiencing these states is that. Yeah, I mean, whatever you're paying attention to generally generates eddies and vortices in your field of consciousness, and those kind of like take up space. And some of these kind of very advanced entities or modes of organization, they require quite a bit of space, a lot of kind of like your real conscious real state, as it were, for the organization to even take place. I mean, it is kind of like, if you want to build a computer of a certain kind, you do require a threshold number of kind of materials and circuits being put to the task. And if you don't have that, then like the computation just cannot happen. I think that, like the rainbow body collective, as it were, is something that like, it doesn't happen if you have a strong ego hanging around, because that's just taking up too much space and it's emitting waves that are just not compatible with that other mode of organization. So typically the kind of like most expressive and complete way in which this quote unquote superintelligences manifest is usually after you have, in my experience at least, is usually after you have processed significant trauma or some significant personal event, and you can really let go, and you're kind of like, okay, and now I'm fine. I'm not I'm not criticizing myself. My inner critic is really silent. I'm good. I'm not judging myself. I'm not judging others. It's all okay. And when you're in kind of that state of contentment without kind of like having a strong desire, that's kind of like the optimal consciousness soil, as it were, for these modes of organization. I mean, one possibility. I mean, like one thing that I guess I should touch upon it like very broadly is that like it is very strange. It's just like the amount of evidence of like strange things in the world, and just like how the average person fails to kind of like integrate it and try to like make sense of a coherent worldview that takes into account all of those strange things. Going from UFOs to like ghosts to like exorcisms to all kinds of strange things that happen to people. Energy healing and so on. And of course, it's easy to kind of like be dismissive and say like, well, we have hallucinations and so on. But a lot of these things are actually quite difficult to debunk, as it were. And there's no kind of like clear picture that emerges. I mean, if anything, it seems like the picture is really complicated with like a lot of factions or sub-factions and subcomponents. And two things also we can maybe infer, which I kind of hate, to be honest, because it makes me sound very crackpotish, but like, it's almost as if like part of what being human is, or like the thing that allows us to be human, is like easily dismissing these things. Like if we didn't have in our programming kind of like, being able to experience a ghost and then just like, whatever, like if you forget about it. If we didn't have that, maybe we would never build civilization, because we would always be trying to construct a coherent worldview, and we would never finish it. Like there's something about kind of like, there's something actually adaptive and intelligent about just not taking seriously any of the strange thing, including 5-MeO DMT and so on, because then you can focus on building families and societies and create the human world, as it were, at the exclusion of everything else. That's one component, and then the other is that the impression that I get, and I guess I also hate to describe it this way, but like the impression that I get from these quote unquote superintelligences is that they can actually kind of read your mind. To a large extent, they can play with what you know. And like a lot of what gates kind of like access to these things is being in the right frame of mind, where they know for a fact that you're not going to kind of like misuse that information, as it were. Right? Like, of course, that makes me wonder, like, what conditions in reality have led so that now I can actually talk openly about this, right? But at the same time, there's like a bunch of things that I have experienced that in the moment, it felt like, okay, this changes a lot my understanding of consciousness. And then as I was coming down either from meditation or like 5-MeO, for example, the sense of like, okay, this actually is getting censored right now, and like no matter what I try, this information is blocked, and I'm not gonna be able to remember it. Almost, and sometimes with the explicit message of like, yeah, we're doing this deliberately. You're not supposed to remember this because it would be very disruptive. So there's almost kind of like a epistemological control as well. And like from that perspective, yeah, maybe humans are kind of like, I don't know, we're kind of like ants from the point of view of these other intelligences. They don't have an incentive to like tell us that they're real, even though they could. That, or maybe it's just kind of very, very slow process for us to kind of come to terms with this reality without being shocked. That's another possibility. And finally, that yeah, there might be like many factions, and for that reason, it's not like they really gain an advantage by being known. In fact, there might be, I mean, in the worst case scenario, which I do think about, like there might be kind of like a dark forest game theory involved, where us humans, we're kind of like pretty dumb in how we manage game theory, and that like, hey, we are advertising our existence to the rest of the universe. But that is just a recipe to be completely, colonized, annihilated, utilized for resources, mined, whatever. Whereas, yeah, the smart entities, the smart intelligences, they hide. They're in the darkness because they know they're going to be otherwise, yeah, somehow exploited or eliminated. So it might very well be that, yeah, if it's a very complex, game theory, the reason why they are kind of hidden or covered is for very deep game theoretical reasons, which we probably don't even suspect.
Okay, can I just I just wanted to further know where is located your Occam razor about as you always say, those entities are not something that could be produced by your own brain, because I feel like a lot of our own language on civilization run at about 10 bits per second, whereas inside our brain, between our lobes or things like that, it is in gigabytes of information. So maybe because of the connection cut of altered state, we can generate those entities. And why didn't those faction try to hack somehow you, or I don't know?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons. Yeah, like the Occam's razor, as it were, for me to kind of like jump into the boat of like, oh my gosh, guys, this is real. Like, it's not a hallucination. It's a pretty high bar. So yeah, I mean, at least I hope I've developed enough of a public strong epistemology that like if someday in Twitter I say like, guys, these are real actually, like hopefully people understand that, okay, like some really high threshold was covered, or was crossed, which it has not happened at this point. Like I can, even though there's kind of like very strange hypercomputation involved, it still to me seems consistent with kind of like hacking the parameters of my world simulation in such a way that I gain access to like really empower like nonlinear optics and like optimization processes, and or maybe even quantum mechanical computing, and it's all in my brain. I think like all of that is very, 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 very plausible. And yeah, the sort of evidence that I would essentially require, I mean, on two fronts, right? Like on just the computational capacity front, it will be either something like being able to solve like NP complete problems that we can't even solve with a supercomputer. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, and that I actually find kind of implausible. I don't think that's going to happen personally. But the other possibility is like if we really arrive at kind of like very solid, theoretically consistent, empirically verified upper bounds for computation in, for example, brain organoids. Or like if we really study them, including their electromagnetic field, maybe the whatever microtubule interactions are happening, and we shield them inside a Faraday cage, and we really kind of like prevent any kind of interaction with the environment, and we measure what is the upper bound of possible computation. And then we find out that, hey, on 5-MeO DMT, you can do like 1 trillion times better than like what was expected for your brain. even in the best circumstances, then yes, okay, that would be really powerful evidence. But then finally, I think like the fastest kind of route, and presumably a lot of people are trying to do this. So if it's true, we will find out sooner or later. Modulo, if we can accept it, which probably we probably wouldn't. I'm not sure. It's more on the side of kind of like telepathy type experiments, where the way in which you verify that this is not just a hallucination is that you're accessing objectively verifiable information that is just hidden elsewhere in the world, right? Like very classically things like remote viewing or telepathy. I mean, I guess if the telepathy tapes turn out to not be fraudulent and like it's replicated and all of that, okay, that would probably indicate that, yeah, a lot of this DMT stuff is maybe, kind of synchronizing with a morphogenetic field or something crazy like that. Again, yeah, I'm definitely not ready to jump ship. I think I would require a lot of processing to accept something like that personally. But I'm open to that possibility. It is worth mentioning too that, I mean, as far as kind of like the U.S. government and MK Ultra and so on studying kind of exotic states of consciousness and remote viewing, it really does seem that some substances can kind of like enhance these. And yeah, there's whistleblowers that mention that drugs have been involved in. I know this is ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous. Yeah, but drugs have been involved in things like summoning UFOs and things like that. They're like, I mean, maybe if you go UFO hunting with a DMT vape pen and somebody's recording, it's not just your hallucination, but somebody's recording what's happening in the sky. Like maybe that would be another way of proving it. If like you can legitimately summon and UFOs and they behave in really strange ways, and they have like, the right kind of like optical effects. Just because you're smoking DMT and wanting it to happen, like, okay, that also would probably convince me. But yeah, to this date, nothing like that has happened to me.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right.
Person. The son of soul.
Son of soul.
Hey everyone.
Hello.
I'll try to make this really quick since I know you have to go soon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I know you're not like a strict biological naturalist or anything like that, because I've heard you say on multiple occasions that like you think we can build like a conscious optical quantum computer, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, do you think that there are regions of the state space of qualia that are restricted to certain substrates? Like, for example, like only biological substrates can access these certain qualia varieties and other substrates can't? Or do you think you can actually build like a quantum computer that can access the whole thing?
I would my hypothesis here, and I would give it maybe something like 90% credence. So I'm open to the alternative, but like my default assumption, and I'll explain why, is that there are indeed very substrate specific qualia that you cannot fake or replicate with a more general substrate. That said, I do suspect there's a lot of regions of the status of qualia that can be replicated in many, many, many different ways. And like many different, let's say, optical quantum computer architectures will probably be able to replicate the same qualia varieties. There's some that I do think require very, very specific substrates. Let me give you kind of like an argument or paint the picture for why. But essentially, different materials, for example, metamaterials, can alter, not only kind of like the relative distances between atoms. Let's say like, okay, like this metamaterial has like copper atoms at a certain distance from each other. I mean, first of all, like if that distance is kind of like very specific, there's specific electromagnetic waves that can actually only fit in that substrate. But even more than that, the specific material, even to the level of like what isotopes you're using, may change the topological shape of the electromagnetic field within the material. And I mean, yeah, like topological metamaterials, for example, a very active area of research. I think like that's going to become much, 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 much popular in the future. People are going to be investigating a lot more. Probably generate really, really unique qualia spaces because you can't fake that. You can't kind of like scale it and make it larger because maybe you can scale the field and the shape or the topology kind of resembles it in a larger scale. But if it's made of different materials, the precise ratios of the distances between the different regions of the field and how they're coupled together will not be the same. And I don't think you can fake it with kind of like a more general processor, as it were. So yeah, if you actually want to have a full general, Qualia computer, you will require kind of like metamaterial manufacturing technology on the fly as well. That like, hey, you're playing with this like gigantic brain made of lots of different materials, with a lot of, let's say, like holographic properties, and then on the fly, maybe you arrive at like, oh my gosh, like I would increase the bliss of the system if I added 1 gram of like a high entropy alloy made of these 5 metals in this region, and it has to be heated up and cooled down in exactly the right way in order to get the right topological properties and affect the field in the way that I want. So that is my tentative answer. I think there's probably hedonium out there, as it were, is probably a very exotic material. It probably has never been made, and it probably needs to be made in a very, very specific way for it to actually work out.
Cool. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so I think this is it. I guess like I feel generous. If there's any one last question, I'm happy to answer it, and then I'll close it down. But yes, Bernie, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to say that I really love this very end that what you just said. That's maybe this very general topological electromagnetic field shapeshifter that could construct on the fly arbitrary materials that have arbitrary configurations of the electromagnetic field in the state space of the electromagnetic fields. That feels like the ultimate Qualia generality dream, assuming that the electromagnetic field equals the field of consciousness.
Yes.
That's amazing. Maybe
Awesome.
it will sometimes happen. Okay.
Quite possibly. All right. Yeah, I guess if anybody has one last question, I do have the energy for one. Otherwise, very happy to close it. I'll give you.
No more questions.
Okay, Silver asked this question. Or shit, it's a long question. Okay, I'll read it. Why do you think external electrical fields don't have any noticeable effects on human consciousness? Susan Pocket talked about this in an interview and suggested that it is because only certain frequencies influence consciousness. This kind of explanation feels uncomfortable to me, like it seems arbitrary, that only certain frequencies would have a subjective component and not super compatible with idealism. In Principia Qualia, Mike Johnson even suggested that there could be effects in consciousness that are just not reportable, which feels even more uncomfortable to me. So I'm wondering, do you think this type of explanation is required? Or could the other brain just insulate the conscious parts from external fields? Yeah, I'll mention a couple things. I mean, yes, topological insulators are a thing. In metamaterials, there are some materials that topologically shield the structure of the electromagnetic field, and then interacting with them electromagnetically is very, very difficult, right? So you can bombard it with like heat or specific frequencies, and like what's inside that topologically shielded region is kind of like nothing is happening to it. And the way in which you actually can interact with it will require you to kind of undo the topological shielding, which is a different operation than interacting with the frequencies that are inside whatever is being topologically shielded. I mean, again, yeah, think of the flux plasma tubes in the sun, right? That they're kind of like trapped inside their tubes in a way. And the only way for them to kind of interact with each other strongly is for the tubes to actually touch, and then like the magnetic field lines exchange partners in the process that's called magnetic reconnection. So I think like that might be a very big component of it. Like there might be a lot of topological shielding in the brain. Another thing too is that you need to potentially even independent of topological shielding. I think you need to interact with specific topologies in addition to just frequencies. This is also an active area of research, and I'm sure it's going to explode in the future. But you can, for example, create knotted photons. Like, yeah, you can look it up on Google Scholar. Like, there's articles that show that you can create, electromagnetic waves that are actually in the shape of a trefoil knot. And they will interact with matter in a special way, essentially. And they're resilient. They kind of like preserve their topology as they move around. I think one of the reasons, transcranial magnetic stimulation is somewhat limited is because it's really just optimized to generate a strong magnetic field, but they don't care about the topology of it. Whereas if you had kind of like a really carefully constructed, and I'm speculating here, but let's say like a phased array that is very carefully constructed in such a way that it generates very specific electromagnetic knots, then I would imagine, I wouldn't bet on this, but I would suspect it would have like much stronger interactions with specific regions of the brain. And you could probably learn a lot about like what kind of topologies of the electromagnetic field are being used in different parts of the brain with a technology like that. I mean, it might be something like, oh my gosh, the amygdala responds super strongly to a trefoil knot, but maybe the prefrontal cortex doesn't, right? So that would be another reason why, we don't really interact all that much. And then, the other thing is, you may actually bite the bullet, and I know this is on the more kind of a speculative side, and say like, hey, actually telepathy is real, and it is actually interacting at a distance, with perhaps the electromagnetic field, perhaps through topological knots of some sort that allow you to kind of like have this private channel of communication, as it were, with somebody else. And I mean, maybe it's unwise for me to end it this way, but it is very widely reported, for example, for people to feel when a family member dies, right? And it happens so frequently and so strongly that I am led to believe that, there's probably something there. I mean, my credence there is maybe like 10-20% that like, hey, this is actually a real physical verifiable effect of kind of like a electromagnetic topology entanglement between people, if they're really close together, or like they love each other, or they're part of the same family. In which case, the premise is incorrect, right? It's like, hey, actually there is a bunch of interaction. It's just that we are very bad at measuring it and integrating that information and like reporting it and scientifically studying it. Those are my thoughts on that question. Awesome.
Nice. I guess you can make a ending speech or something.
Oh yes, okay. Ending speech. Yes, well, we've got to make team consciousness succeed. This requires us to essentially be very mindful and vigilant of how like replicators can arise at any level of organization, from viruses to addictions to memes to political movements to like delusions, like habitual patterns and so on. The other thing too is, just to remind you, like if we spent even just like 0.01% of the attention that we dedicate to zero-sum games, let's say in politics or economics, to getting rid of extreme suffering, we would be able to accomplish it. So, it's something that, I feel somewhat ambivalent about talking because it's not pleasant to talk about it, but the payoff might be just so unbelievably great, and we will be so happy that we actually helped as a community. Effective altruism definitely has as a claim of fame, so to speak, saving millions of people from malaria and like dying from malaria. And like, that might be controversial in some circles, but like it's overall like an overwhelming like win, right? It's like, oh my gosh, these like nerds actually, they rolled up their sleeves and they were able to make something happen. And like, what the heck? It worked. Amazing. Intelligence and empathy can actually work. Okay, so something like that. I mean, like I do genuinely believe in 10 years, let's say, maybe even sooner, in 10 years, we can get rid of all cluster headaches in the world. Would be a massive win for consciousness. And And I also anticipate a lot of kind of a good karma coming from that. So many grateful people who, we save them from hell, so to speak. And I don't want to kind of cultivate any kind of savior complex or anything of the sort. As low ego as possible in this enterprise. But it's just something that would be very heartwarming, very good for the world, and very doable as well. Then, the other thing to maybe kind of like motivate and say like, hey, we've got this and we can work together as a community is, let's be really optimistic about like being able to visualize phenomenology. I mean, like, do play as much as possible with AI technologies and like code faster with it. Develop technologies to visualize the states of consciousness. My vision, not only for QRI, I mean, obviously I want QRI to grow, be very central, important. I obviously am in charge of that, and I want that to grow. But also, I want the ecosystem of people interested in team consciousness to grow. So like it's, I'm generally very, very generous in terms of like giving credit and like trying to boost everybody's work who are kind of like working in this direction. And the vision that I have is like, well, right now we have something like, for example, R replications, right? Like to depict different state of consciousness and vote on them and comment on them. What I think we need, we're going to work on this at QRI, but it's really going to become a community effort. It's going to be a kind of like a large collective of people who are trying to replicate specific phenomenologies and trying to use those replications to induce positive states of consciousness and help each other out. And then a very visible kind of like central hub where we can all upvote, and comment on and rate and do scientific studies on these visualizations. And I think like these might be paradigm shifting in terms of making the effing the ineffable, right? Like taking the invisible substrate of consciousness and actually putting it out there so that we can, cultivate the better angels of our nature and heal as a collective. So with that, go team consciousness. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to interacting, bonding, having great experiences with all of you. Thank you so much. Much love, infinite bliss.